Caleb Thornridge had seen men die in ways that would haunt a lifetime, but nothing prepared him for what the blizzard delivered to his doorstep. Two women, identical faces, barely breathing. One wore a torn gray dress that should have frozen her solid hours ago. The other clutched a blood-stained letter in fingers blue as midnight. As he dragged them through waist-deep snow toward his cabin, his war-trained instincts screamed a single warning: someone powerful wanted them dead. And when those men came looking, because they would come, Caleb would have to decide whether survival was worth the cost of solitude. If you're ready to discover how a broken soldier and two desperate sisters built something unbreakable in the cruelest winter Wyoming ever witnessed, stay with me until the end, and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The wind came first. It always did in the high plains of Wyoming territory, arriving like an advance scout before the main army. Caleb Thornridge stood on his porch, one hand braced against the weathered post, watching the sky turn the color of old bruises. The thermometer nailed beside his door read 23 degrees. By nightfall, it would drop below zero. He'd lived through worse. 6 winters in this godforsaken stretch of nowhere had taught him that nature didn't negotiate. You prepared or you died. Simple mathematics. "Storm's coming, Bear." The words came out rough, unused. Caleb's voice had gone days without speaking. His only companion, a grizzled cattle dog with one clouded eye, lifted his gray muzzle and whined low in his throat. Caleb descended the porch steps, his boots crunching through the previous night's frost. The cabin sat in a shallow valley surrounded by nothing but rolling grassland and distant peaks. 30 head of cattle grazed somewhere in the expanse beyond. He needed to check the creek fence before the blizzard hit, make sure they had access to unfrozen water. The solitude suited him. After what he'd seen, what he'd done, during the war, silence felt like absolution. No questions, no judgment, just wind, cattle, and the slow march of seasons that cared nothing for human suffering. He saddled his mare, a steady buckskin named Patience, and rode out with Bear trotting alongside. The world stretched empty in every direction, endless grass rippling under the strengthening wind. Overhead clouds gathered with purpose, dark and heavy with snow. The fence line looked solid. The creek ran clear and cold, not yet frozen despite the temperature. Caleb dismounted and walked the perimeter, checking each post. His breath formed white clouds that the wind tore apart before they could fully form. That's when Bear stopped. The dog went rigid, ears forward, staring toward a copse of scrub pine maybe 200 yards north. A growl rumbled deep in his chest. Not the warning bark he gave for coyotes or wolves, but something different. Uncertain. "What is it, boy?" Bear took 3 steps forward, then looked back at Caleb. The message was clear. Something's wrong. Caleb's hand dropped instinctively to the Colt revolver at his hip. Old habits. The war had been over for 8 years, but some reflexes never died. He swung back into the saddle and urged Patience toward the trees. The wind hit harder here, unobstructed and vicious. The first snowflakes began to fall. Not the gentle flutter of a winter's greeting, but hard pellets that stung exposed skin. The blizzard's leading edge. Bear barked once, sharp and insistent. Caleb saw it then. A dark shape against the white ground, partially obscured by drifting snow. Too large for an animal. Too still. He dismounted before Patience fully stopped, hitting the ground at a run. His boots sank through snow that was already 4 inches deep and accumulating fast. The shape resolved as he approached. Fabric, dark and sodden. A person. A woman. She lay face down, one arm outstretched as if she'd been crawling. Her dress was thin cotton, completely inadequate for the temperature. No coat. No gloves. Her black hair spilled across the snow like ink on paper. Caleb dropped to his knees beside her and pressed 2 fingers to her throat. A pulse. Faint and slow, but present. Her skin was ice under his touch. "Ma'am?" He turned her over gently. She was young, maybe 25, with delicate features and skin that would have been golden-toned in warmth, but had gone gray with cold. Her lips were blue. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" No response. Unconscious or near enough, hypothermia, without question. He needed to get her to the cabin immediately. The temperature was dropping by the minute, and the snow was coming down in sheets now, visibility already down to maybe 50 feet. Caleb stripped off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her, then lifted her in his arms. She weighed almost nothing. He turned toward Patience. Bear barked again. Different this time. More urgent. Not now, Bear. We need to... The dog wouldn't stop. He ran 10 feet toward a cluster of rocks, barked, then ran back, over and over. Damn it! Caleb carried the woman to Patience and draped her across the saddle, securing her with the reins so she wouldn't slide off. Then he followed Bear toward the rocks. The snow was falling so thick now he could barely see the dog. His face burned with cold, and his shirt, inadequate without the coat, was already soaked through. The blizzard had arrived in full force. Bear stood beside another dark shape, another body. Jesus Christ! This woman lay on her side, curled into herself. She wore an identical gray dress, the same thin fabric. But as Caleb knelt beside her and turned her over, he felt his breath catch. She had the same face, exactly the same delicate bone structure, the same mouth, the same arch of eyebrows. For a disorienting moment, Caleb thought he was seeing double, some trick of the cold and wind. Twins. They were twins. This one's pulse was even weaker. Her breathing so shallow he had to put his cheek near her mouth to confirm it existed. She clutched something in her right hand. Paper, he thought, but couldn't tell in the storm. No time to investigate, no time for questions. The blizzard was a living thing now, howling and hungry, trying to bury everything in its path. Caleb lifted the second woman and carried her to Patience. The mare shifted uneasily, overwhelmed by the sudden burden of two bodies, but she held steady. Good horse. He secured the second woman as best he could, then grabbed Patience's reins and started walking. The cabin couldn't be more than a quarter-mile away. He knew this land like he knew his own scars. But in a whiteout, a quarter-mile might as well be 10. He put his head down against the wind and walked, one hand gripping the reins, the other outstretched to feel for obstacles. Bear stayed close, his dark shape just barely visible. Time stopped meaning anything. There was only wind and snow and cold that sank into bones and turned muscle to stone. Caleb's fingers went numb. His feet became distant things at the end of his legs. He focused on movement. One step. Another. Keep moving or die. When the cabin's dark shape finally emerged from the white chaos, relief nearly buckled his knees. He led Patience to the porch, then lifted the first woman down. She hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound. He carried her inside and laid her on the floor near the fireplace, then went back for the second. Both of them lay motionless, their breathing barely perceptible. Caleb's hand shook, from cold or shock, he couldn't say, as he built up the fire. The cabin was cold, maybe 40 degrees, but it felt tropical compared to outside. He piled wood onto the embers until flames roared up the chimney, heat beginning to radiate into the room. Then he went to work. He'd seen hypothermia during the war, men who fell through ice or got separated from their units during winter campaigns. The treatment was simple in theory, brutal in execution. Rewarm them slowly, or their hearts would stop from the shock. Caleb dragged both women closer to the fire, but not too close. Then he stripped off their wet dresses with clinical efficiency. Soaked cotton would kill them as surely as the cold. He wrapped them in every blanket he owned, then in the heavy buffalo robe from his bed. Their skin was mottled blue and white, their fingers and toes nearly black. He boiled water and soaked rags, then pressed the warm, not hot, cloths to their hands and feet, replacing them every few minutes as they cooled. The process was painstaking. An hour passed. Then 2. Outside, the blizzard raged. Inside, the cabin filled with firelight and the quiet rhythm of survival. The first one to stir was the woman who'd been clutching the paper. Her fingers twitched, then her eyelids fluttered. Caleb was beside her immediately, kneeling on the rough plank floor. "Easy," he said softly. "You're safe. You're inside." Her eyes opened, dark brown, almost black, and filled with immediate panic. She tried to sit up, and Caleb gently pressed her shoulder. "Don't move too fast. You're recovering from severe cold exposure." She stared at him, breathing quickening. Then her head turned, searching, until she found the other woman lying 3 feet away. "Leanne." The word came out cracked and desperate. She tried again to rise. "Your sister's alive," Caleb said quickly. "She's breathing. She's warming up, but you need to stay still. The woman, Maylene, he assumed, if the other was Leon, stopped struggling. Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes. You're certain? I'm certain. She closed her eyes and her body went limp with relief. Thank you. The words were barely audible, but they carried weight. Gratitude and grief and exhaustion all folded into 2 syllables. Caleb sat back on his heels. Can you tell me what happened? Why were you out there in a storm with no coats? Maylin's eyes opened again. She studied his face for a long moment, as if deciding whether to trust him. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite its hoarseness. We were running. From what? Not what. Who? Her gaze shifted to the fire. Men who believe they own us. The simple statement sent a chill through Caleb that had nothing to do with the temperature. He'd seen slavery, fought against it, watched men die to end it. The war was supposed to have settled that question. Slavery's illegal, he said flatly. Not all chains are made of iron. Maylene's attention returned to him. Some are made of debt, or fear, or laws that protect men with money, and nothing else. Before Caleb could respond, the other woman, Leanne, gasped. Her back arched slightly, and her eyes flew open. Unlike her sister's immediate panic, Leanne's gaze was sharp and assessing from the first moment of consciousness. She took in the cabin, the fire, Caleb kneeling between them, all in the span of perhaps 3 seconds. Where's my sister? Her voice was different from Maylene's, more formal, each word precisely shaped. Right here. Maylene struggled to lift her hand, and Leanne turned her head to see. The relief that crossed Leanne's face was profound but controlled. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them and looked at Caleb again. You brought us inside. It wasn't a question, but Caleb nodded anyway. Found you about a quarter-mile north. Another few minutes, you'd both have been dead. Then we are in your debt. Leanne's tone carried the weight of formal obligation. Though I suspect payment will be complicated. I don't want payment. Everyone wants something. The cynicism in those words spoke of hard experience. Caleb understood cynicism. He lived with it every day. Right now, he said carefully, what I want is to make sure you don't lose any fingers or toes to frostbite. We can discuss complicated later. He spent the next hour continuing the rewarming process, changing out warm compresses, checking circulation. The sisters watched him work with an attention that felt like measurement, testing him, judging. The blizzard continued its assault outside. Wind screamed around the cabin's corners. Snow piled against the walls. They weren't going anywhere for days. As feeling returned to their extremities, both women began to shiver violently. A good sign, actually. It meant their bodies were warming enough to respond. Caleb wrapped them in additional blankets and moved them even closer to the fire. You should have a coat, Leon said, eyeing his thin shirt. You gave yours to one of us. I'll survive. Unnecessary sacrifice breeds resentment. She glanced at her sister. Maylene, his coat is on the chair. Before Caleb could protest, Maylene had somehow managed to retrieve it despite her weakened state. She held it out to him with both hands, a gesture that looked almost ceremonial. We don't wish to be burdens requiring resentment, she said quietly. Caleb took the coat. These women were unusual. Even half frozen and wrapped in blankets, they maintained a kind of dignity that commanded respect. He shrugged into the coat, and some of the deep cold finally began to leave his own bones. I need to know what I'm dealing with, he said bluntly. Who's coming after you? The sisters exchanged a look. Some unspoken communication passed between them, the kind only twins probably shared. Leon answered, His name is Chen Wei. He was a merchant in San Francisco, wealthy, connected, powerful. And you belong to him? We were sold to him, Maylene said softly. 4 years ago. Our family owed debts. We were the payment. Caleb's jaw tightened. Your family sold you. Our father died owing money to the wrong men. Our mother was sick. Our younger brothers would have starved. Leon's voice remained steady, factual. We understood the mathematics of survival. Chenwei owned a establishment, Maylene continued when her sister paused. A place where wealthy men came for entertainment. We were the entertainment. Caleb didn't need the details spelled out. He'd seen such places during the war. in cities both north and south, wherever soldiers congregated with money to spend. The women who worked in them rarely had choices. You escaped. 3 weeks ago. Lian pulled the blanket tighter. Chenwei was traveling to Sacramento for business. The woman who managed the house grew careless. We took what we could and ran. Why come north? San Francisco's a port. You could have found a ship. Chenwei has connections everywhere the railroad reaches, Lian interrupted. Ports, stage lines, hotels. He has money to pay informants and bounty hunters. We needed to go where civilization thinned out, where we could disappear. Wyoming territory's a hard place to disappear, Caleb said. Population's sparse, but that means strangers stand out. We were attempting to reach Montana. We'd heard there were mining camps that asked no questions. Maylin's voice grew quieter. We had a guide. He brought us this far, then took our remaining money and left us during the night. 3 days ago. 3 days. They'd survived 3 days in the wilderness with no supplies, no shelter, no protection. That they'd made it until the blizzard hit was remarkable. The letter you were holding, Caleb said to Maylin. What was it? She hesitated, then reached into the folds of her blanket. The paper was still there, crumpled and damp. She smoothed it carefully before handing it over. The writing was in Chinese characters, which Caleb couldn't read. But at the bottom was a crude sketch. 2 faces, side by side, identical. And beneath that, English words in rough block letters, $500 each. Alive. Chenwei, San Francisco. A bounty notice. Not official law, but private enterprise. $1,000 was a fortune. Men would kill for 1/10 of that. He won't stop looking, Lian said, watching Caleb examine the paper. We are valuable property. And worse, we made him look foolish by escaping. Pride will drive him as much as profit. Caleb tossed another log on the fire. Sparks spiraled up the chimney. Outside, the storm continued its work, burying the world in white. He should put them back out in the morning. That was the smart play. The safe play. He'd done his Christian duty by saving their lives. But getting involved beyond that, harboring fugitives from a man with money and reach, that was asking for trouble he didn't need. The war had taught him that trouble came regardless of what you asked for. The storm will last at least 2 days, he said finally. Maybe 3. After that, the snow will be too deep for travel for another week. You'll stay here until the thaw. And then? Lian's question was direct. I don't know yet. It wasn't much of an answer, but it was honest. That night, Caleb gave the sisters his bed, the only real bed in the cabin. He fashioned a pallet near the fire for himself, with Bear curled against his side. Through the thin cabin walls, he could hear the sisters speaking to each other in their own language, voices low and musical. He tried not to think about what would happen when the snow melted. Tried not to think about bounty hunters with $1,000 dancing in their heads. Tried not to think about how the sisters' presence had already changed something fundamental in the cabin's atmosphere, filled some hollow space he'd stopped noticing was empty. The fire burned low. The storm raged on, and Caleb Thornridge, who'd spent 6 years successfully avoiding human connection, fell asleep to the sound of 2 women's breathing in the darkness. The blizzard didn't let up. For 3 days, snow fell without ceasing. Wind carved drifts against the cabin walls that reached the windowsills. The world contracted to the size of 4 rough walls and a stone fireplace. Caleb had supplies for 1 person through the winter. Flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, a few precious tins of vegetables. With 3 mouths to feed, those supplies would dwindle fast, but there was nothing to be done about it. They couldn't leave even if they wanted to. The sisters recovered with remarkable speed. By the second day, they were both up and moving, though still weak. Caleb watched them navigate the tiny cabin with careful efficiency, speaking rarely but communicating constantly through looks and small gestures. They never got in each other's way, never duplicated effort. When Lian started to reach for something, Maylene was already handing it to her. When Maylene began a task, Lian seamlessly continued it. It was like watching one person split into 2 bodies. On the 3rd morning, Caleb woke to find them already awake. Maylene was grinding coffee beans, something he usually did himself. Lian was examining his coat, which he'd hung on the back of the chair. This is torn, Lian said, running her finger along a rip in the shoulder seam. Bull caught it with a horn last month. I meant to fix it. You have needle and thread? Caleb hesitated. In the chest by the bed. But you don't need to. Leon was already retrieving the sewing kit. She settled into the chair with his coat spread across her lap and began repairing the tear with small, precise stitches. Maylene poured coffee into 3 tin cups. She handed one to Caleb without asking if he wanted it, then brought the second to her sister. The third she kept for herself. They moved through the cabin like they belonged there. It should have irritated him. Caleb had lived alone for years. He'd built this life specifically around solitude, but their presence didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like something else, something he didn't have words for. You don't have to work, he said gruffly. You're recovering. We're recovered, Leanne replied without looking up from her stitching. Sitting idle breeds weakness. We are not accustomed to being decorative, Maylene added. She'd found his stockpot and was inspecting it with a critical eye. This needs proper cleaning. It's clean enough. She gave him a look that suggested his standards were inadequate, then began heating water. Caleb sipped his coffee and tried to decide if he'd lost control of his own cabin. That afternoon, the wind finally began to ease. The snow still fell, but lighter now. The blizzard was dying. Caleb forced the door open against the drift and stepped outside to assess the damage. Snow reached nearly to his knees. The barn, a small structure where he kept patients and his few chickens, was half buried. He'd need to dig out paths, check on the animals, clear the roof before the weight caused collapse. He was calculating the work ahead when Leanne appeared beside him, wrapped in his extra blanket. How much snow? She asked. 3 feet. Maybe more where it drifted. She studied the landscape with the same assessing look she'd given everything else. The cattle? They know how to find shelter. I'll check on them once I can move freely. We could help. You've never worked a ranch. We can learn. There was something in her tone, not quite defiance, but close, a refusal to be helpless. Caleb looked at her properly. In the gray light of the dying storm, she was striking. Not beautiful in the conventional sense, her features were too strong for that, her gaze too direct, but striking nonetheless. Why? He asked. Why what? Why offer to help? You'll be gone as soon as the thaw allows. No reason to learn skills you won't use. Leanne pulled the blanket tighter. You saved our lives. We repay debts. I told you. I know what you told me. Her eyes met his, dark and unflinching. But we know the truth of the world. Everything has a price. You will realize you want payment eventually. When you do, we'd prefer to have already earned it. The cynicism again. The bone-deep expectation of exploitation. Caleb wanted to argue, to insist she was wrong about him, but he'd learned during the war that words were cheap, actions mattered. Fair enough, he said instead. Tomorrow, if the weather holds, I'll teach you how to shovel snow. The corner of Leanne's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. That night, they ate a simple dinner of beans and salt pork. Caleb had never been much of a cook. Food was fuel, nothing more. But Maylene had somehow transformed the basic ingredients into something that actually had flavor. She'd found his meager herb collection, sage, dried thyme, and used them with a precision that suggested training. Where did you learn to cook? Caleb asked. Our mother's kitchen, Maylene said. Before, when we were children. She taught you well. She taught us many things. Maylene's voice went soft, though she never imagined we would need them in a place like this. After dinner, Leanne insisted on continuing her inventory of everything in the cabin that needed repair. She'd moved from the coat to his spare shirt to the chair that wobbled when you sat in it wrong. You live like a man preparing to leave at any moment, she observed, tightening the chair's loose screws with a knife blade. Nothing permanent, nothing maintained beyond necessity. Efficient, Caleb countered. Lonely. The word landed like a blow. Caleb's jaw tightened. I choose solitude. Yes. Leanne tested the chair, found it solid, and moved on to examine the window frame. But that doesn't make it less lonely. Maylene shot her sister a warning look. Some boundary had been crossed, but Caleb found he wasn't angry, just exposed. This woman he'd known for 3 days had seen through carefully constructed walls to the truth beneath. The war? Leanne asked quietly, still examining the window. Among other things. She nodded, asking nothing more. The mercy of that silence felt profound. Later, as Caleb lay on his pallet by the dying fire, he listened to the sisters preparing for sleep. They spoke in their own language again, voices barely above whispers. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone, comfort, reassurance, the sound of two people who'd survived by protecting each other. Bear lifted his head and whined softly. "I know, boy," Caleb murmured. "I know." The storm ended that night. Morning came cold and crystalline, the sky scrubbed clean and impossibly blue. Sunlight blazed off the snow, turning the world into a field of diamonds, beautiful and treacherous in equal measure. Caleb stepped outside and began the hard work of digging out. The sisters joined him despite his protests, Leanne wielding a shovel with determination, if not skill, Maylene clearing smaller paths with a piece of board. They worked for hours. By midday, they'd cleared a path to the barn and another to the woodpile. All three of them were exhausted, breath coming in white clouds, muscles screaming. Caleb was about to suggest they stop when Bear suddenly went rigid. The dog's ears flattened, and a growl rumbled in his chest. The same uncertain warning he'd given before Caleb found the sisters. Caleb's hand dropped to his Colt. "Inside. Now." The sisters didn't argue. They moved quickly toward the cabin while Caleb scanned the landscape. There, on the eastern ridge, three riders, dark shapes against the brilliant snow, sitting motionless on horseback, too far away to identify, but close enough to have been watching for some time. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to think. They were at least half a mile off. The snow would slow them if they tried to approach, but eventually they would come. He backed toward the cabin, keeping his eyes on the riders. When he reached the door, he slipped inside and barred it. Leanne and Maylene stood by the fireplace, faces pale but controlled. "How many?" Leanne asked. "3 that I saw." Chenway's men. It wasn't a question. She knew. Caleb moved to the window. The riders hadn't moved. They were just watching, waiting. "Why don't they come?" Maylene whispered. "They're deciding if it's worth it," Caleb said grimly. 3 feet of snow. One armed man who might or might not hand you over. They're weighing the risk. And when they decide it is worth it, Caleb checked his revolver. Fully loaded. He had a rifle too, and ammunition, but 3 against 1 were terrible odds, no matter how well armed he was. "Then we'll see," he said quietly, "exactly how far I'm willing to go." The riders remained on the ridge until sunset. Then, as the temperature began to drop and darkness crept across the snow, they turned and rode away. But they'd be back. Caleb knew it with the certainty of breathing. The $1,000 bounty was too much to ignore. That night, no one slept well. Caleb kept watch by the window, rifle across his knees. The sisters huddled together on the bed, speaking in whispers that sounded like prayers. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal. And somewhere in the darkness, 3 men made plans. Dawn broke with the kind of silence that precedes violence. Caleb hadn't moved from the window in hours. His eyes burned from staring into darkness, watching for movement that never came. The rifle felt like an extension of his body now, familiar and necessary. Bear lay at his feet, equally vigilant, ears twitching at sounds only he could hear. Behind him, he sensed rather than saw the sisters rise. No words passed between them, but he heard the whisper of fabric, the soft tread of bare feet on wooden planks. Maylene moved to the fireplace and began coaxing embers back to life. Leanne appeared at his shoulder, wrapped in the blanket, her hair loose around her face. "They're still out there," she said quietly. "I know. You haven't slept. Neither have you." She studied his profile in the growing light. "You're considering your options." It wasn't a question, but Caleb answered anyway. "There aren't many good ones. You could give us to them." Leon's voice remained steady, matter of fact. "Take the $1,000, use it to improve this place. Stock up for next winter. A man could do worse." Caleb's hands tightened on the rifle. "That what you think I'm considering?" "I think you're a practical man. The war taught you that sentiment gets people killed. You don't know us. We're strangers who appeared during a storm and brought trouble to your door." She paused. "It would be reasonable to choose self-preservation." Reasonable. The word tasted bitter. "That what you'd do?" "No. The simple honesty in her answer cut through the tension. But I've never had the luxury of choosing survival without cost. Neither has Maylene. We understand that other people make different calculations. Caleb turned to face her fully. In the pale dawn light, he could see the exhaustion carved into her features, the wariness that went bone deep. This woman expected betrayal the way most people expected sunrise. "I'm not giving you to them," he said flatly. "Then what?" "I don't know yet. But not that." Something shifted in Leon's expression. Not quite trust, but the possibility of it. She nodded once and moved away to help her sister with breakfast. The morning passed in tense preparation. Caleb checked his ammunition. 20 rounds for the rifle, 18 for the Colt. Not enough for a prolonged fight, but sufficient if he made every shot count. He positioned additional weapons around the cabin. A knife on the windowsill, another rifle loaded and leaning near the door, his old cavalry saber wrapped in oiled cloth beneath the bed. The sisters watched his preparations without comment. They'd lived with danger long enough to recognize serious intent when they saw it. "Can you shoot?" Caleb asked Leon. "No." "Ever held a gun?" "Once, in San Francisco. A customer thought it would be entertaining to teach me." Her mouth twisted. "He was disappointed when I refused to find it amusing." Caleb retrieved the Colt from his holster and held it out. "This is a Colt single-action army. 6 rounds. You cock it here, aim, pull the trigger. The recoil will surprise you the first time. Don't fight it." Leon took the weapon gingerly, feeling its weight. "You think it will come to this?" "I think being prepared means considering worse possibilities." He moved behind her, adjusting her grip. 2 hands. Like this. Don't lock your elbows." They spent an hour on basic instruction. Leon proved a quick study, her hand steady despite obvious discomfort with the weapon. Maylene watched, but didn't ask to learn. Caleb suspected she'd frozen at the mention of guns, some memory risen from the depths. By midday, the sun was high and bright, turning the snow-covered landscape into something almost beautiful. Caleb forced himself to eat the beans and cornbread Maylene had prepared, though his stomach rebelled at the thought of food. He needed strength. Whatever came next would require everything he had. "Tell me about Chen Wei," he said abruptly. The sisters exchanged glances. Maylene set down her fork, appetite apparently gone. Leon answered. "He's 43. Came to San Francisco 20 years ago with nothing. Built his fortune through enterprises that serve men's appetites, gambling houses, opium dens, and establishments like the one where we were kept. He has protection, law on his side. He pays well for it. The police don't ask questions about his businesses. The judges rule in his favor. He employs men who make problems disappear." She met Caleb's eyes. "We are a problem he wants disappeared, returned or eliminated. Either outcome suits him." "How many men does he typically send for this kind of work?" "It varies. For something valuable, perhaps 5 or 6. But in winter, in territory this remote," Leon paused, thinking. 3 makes sense. Enough to handle resistance, few enough to move quickly. Caleb nodded slowly. 3 was what he'd seen. 3 was what he'd have to face. "They'll come today," Maylene said softly. "The snow has stopped. They've watched long enough to confirm we're here. Waiting gains them nothing." She was right. Caleb felt it in his bones, that particular tightness that preceded combat. The war had taught him to recognize it. The way time seemed to slow. The way every sense sharpened. The way the world narrowed to immediate threats and necessary actions. Bear suddenly lifted his head, a low growl building in his chest. Caleb was at the window in 2 strides. There, moving through the snow at a careful pace, came the 3 riders. They were perhaps 300 yards out now, close enough that he could make out details. All wore heavy coats. All carried rifles across their saddles. The one in front was bigger than the others, broad-shouldered and confident. "They're coming," Caleb said quietly. Leon moved to his side, the Colt in her hand. Maylene stayed by the fire, her face pale but composed. The riders stopped about 100 yards from the cabin, close enough for conversation, far enough to avoid immediate danger. The big one in front raised his hand in what might have been a peaceful gesture. "You in the cabin," he called out. His voice carried easily across the snow. We're not looking for trouble. Caleb didn't respond. He watched, measured, calculated. We're looking for 2 Chinese women, runaways. There's a reward for their safe return. We know they're in there with you. Still, Caleb said nothing. The man shifted in his saddle. Look, friend, you seem like a reasonable man. This doesn't have to go hard. We'll pay you for the trouble. Say, $200? That's fair compensation for food and shelter. $200. Less than a quarter of the full bounty. Insulting, really, in its assumption that Caleb could be bought cheap. The women are property of Chen Wei of San Francisco, the man continued when Caleb didn't answer. He has legal documentation. We're authorized to retrieve them by any means necessary. Lian's hand tightened on the Colt. He's lying, she whispered. Chen Wei never filed legal papers. It would require admitting what we were, what he did. I know, Caleb murmured back. So what's it going to be? The man called out. Easy money, or we come in and take what's ours? Caleb finally spoke, his voice carrying clear and cold across the snow. The women stay. A long silence followed. The 3 riders conferred among themselves, voices too low to hear. Then the big man laughed, a sound without humor. You're making a mistake, friend. 3 against 1. We're professionals. You're just some rancher playing hero. I was a soldier before I was a rancher, Caleb replied. And I don't play. 1st Cavalry by the look of this place. Maybe 2nd? Doesn't matter. War's been over 8 years. You're rusty. Try me and find out. Another consultation among the riders. Then the big man's tone changed, turned harder. Last chance. Send the women out, take the money, and we all walk away. Otherwise, we're coming in. And when we do, you'll die alongside them. Caleb's answer was to cock the rifle, the metallic click loud in the quiet air. The big man nodded slowly. Your choice. The 3 riders split up, moving to different positions around the cabin. Standard flanking maneuver. Caleb had seen it 100 times during the war. They'd establish a crossfire, make it impossible for him to cover all approaches simultaneously. Get away from the window, he told Lian. Take your sister and get on the floor behind the bed. It's the only solid cover. You can't fight them all. I don't have to win. I just have to make it cost more than they're willing to pay. He glanced at her. Now move. Lian hesitated, then obeyed. She pulled Malin down behind the bed frame, the Colt still gripped in her hand. Bear positioned himself between the women and the door, teeth bared. Caleb moved to the window facing east, where the big man had taken position. The other 2 were circling to the north and south sides. Classic tactics. Predictable. During the war, predictable had gotten a lot of men killed. The first shot came from the north side, shattering the small window above where Caleb kept his supplies. Glass exploded inward, and a bullet buried itself in the far wall. A testing shot, meant to gauge response. Caleb didn't return fire. Ammunition was too precious to waste on warning shots. You're just making this harder on yourself, the big man called out. We can wait you out. You'll run out of supplies long before we give up the bounty. Another shot, this one from the south. It punched through the wooden wall a foot above Caleb's head. They were bracketing his position, trying to pin him down. Caleb dropped low and scrambled to the south-facing window. He caught a glimpse of movement, one of the riders repositioning behind a snowdrift. Quick calculation of distance, wind, and trajectory. He aimed, exhaled slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was deafening in the enclosed space. Through the window, Caleb saw the rider jerk backward, clutching his shoulder. Not a killing shot, but enough to take him out of the fight. 1 down, 2 to go. Return fire came immediately, multiple rounds slamming into the cabin. Wood splintered, the remaining glass in the windows shattered. Malin cried out, not in pain, but in fear. Stay down, Caleb barked. He moved again, this time to the eastern window. The big man was advancing, using trees for cover, moving with the careful competence of someone who'd done this before. Professional, like he'd said. Caleb waited, patient, until the man broke from one tree to the next. Another shot. This one caught the man in the leg, sent him sprawling in the snow. He scrambled behind cover, cursing loudly. 2 down, 1 functional. But the remaining rider was the problem. Caleb had lost track of him during the exchange of fire, and now he couldn't see where... The crash of breaking wood came from the back of the cabin. The rider had circled around to the weakest wall, the one Caleb had been meaning to reinforce for months. Boards splintered as the man forced his way through. Caleb spun, bringing the rifle up, but the rider was already inside and moving fast. Young, maybe 25, with quick reflexes and desperation in his eyes. He fired twice as he came through the gap. The first bullet missed. The second caught Caleb in the side, a searing line of pain that stole his breath. Caleb pulled the trigger. Click. Empty. The rider advanced, leveling his pistol for a killing shot. A gunshot cracked through the cabin, but not from the rider's weapon. The young man stumbled, looking down in confusion at the red bloom spreading across his chest. He turned slowly and saw Leanne standing by the bed, the Colt smoking in her outstretched hands, her face white as bone. The rider opened his mouth to speak, but only blood came out. He collapsed forward, dead before he hit the floor. Silence descended, broken only by harsh breathing and the ringing in Caleb's ears from the gunfire. He pressed a hand to his side and felt warm wetness. Not deep, but bleeding steadily. Caleb. Leanne's voice sounded distant, underwater. She was beside him suddenly, her hands on his arm. You're shot. Grazed. His voice came out rough. The others? I'll check. Maylene was already at the shattered eastern window, peering out carefully. The big one is crawling away. The one you shot first is gone, probably retreated when the shooting started. Caleb made himself move to the window despite the pain. The big man was indeed dragging himself through the snow, leaving a red trail behind him. His horse stood 20 yards away, unattainable. For a moment, Caleb considered finishing it. One more shot would end the threat permanently. His hand tightened on the rifle. But he couldn't do it, couldn't shoot a wounded man crawling away. The war had taken many things from him, but not that. Not yet. He lowered the rifle and watched the man struggle toward his horse. Eventually, with agonizing slowness, the rider managed to mount and urge the animal into motion. Within minutes, he disappeared over the ridge, following the tracks his companion had left earlier. They were gone. For now. Caleb let the rifle clatter to the floor and slumped against the wall. The pain in his side was becoming more insistent, sharp and burning. Blood seeped between his fingers. Leanne knelt beside him, her face composed despite the trembling in her hands. Let me see. He pulled his hand away. The bullet had carved a shallow furrow along his ribs, maybe 4 inches long. Painful and messy, but not life-threatening. He'd had worse during the war. It needs cleaning and bandaging, Leanne said. She looked at her sister. Maylene, water and clean cloth. Maylene moved immediately, grateful for something to do. Her hands shook as she prepared the supplies. Caleb looked at Leanne, really looked at her. She'd just killed a man, shot him through the heart without hesitation to save Caleb's life. But her expression showed something beyond shock. Recognition, maybe. The confirmation of some dark knowledge she'd carried. You did what you had to, he said quietly. I know. She took the cloth from Maylene and began cleaning the wound. That doesn't make it easier. No, it doesn't. They worked in silence, Leanne's touch surprisingly gentle despite her obvious inexperience with wounds. The dead man lay on the floor behind them, blood pooling beneath his body. They'd have to deal with that soon, bury him before the ground froze too hard. But first, survival required immediate attention. When Leanne had finished bandaging his ribs, Caleb tried to stand. Pain lanced through his side, but he gritted his teeth and pushed through it. He'd moved with worse injuries during the war. You need to rest, Leanne protested. I need to secure the cabin. He gestured to the gaping hole in the back wall. That needs boarding up before nightfall, and the body needs to be moved. Maylene spoke for the first time since the shooting. I'll help with the wall. Her voice was thin but determined. Leanne can help you with him. They spent the next hour on grim work. Caleb and Leanne dragged the dead man outside and left him in the snow beside the barn. The ground was frozen too hard for proper burial. They'd have to pile rocks over him, keep scavengers away until spring allowed for better. Maylene found boards and nails and set about repairing the damaged wall with surprising competence. She worked quietly, methodically, each hammer strike precise and controlled. The work seemed to calm her, give her something to focus on besides violence and death. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Caleb stood on the porch and surveyed the damage. Blood stained the snow in multiple places. Shell casings littered the ground. The cabin looked like exactly what it was, the site of a battle. Leanne joined him, wrapped in her blanket against the cold. "They'll come back," she said. "Not those two. They're hurt bad. Lucky if they make it to the nearest town. But others will come. Chenwei has resources. 3 men failed. He'll send 6 next time, or 10. Caleb knew she was right. They'd won this fight, but the war was just beginning. The bounty still stood. The incentive remained. "We can't stay here," Leanne continued. "Not if you want to survive this." "Where would we go? Snow's 3 feet deep. Travel's impossible for weeks yet." Then what do you suggest?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun paint the snow gold and orange. "I don't know," he admitted. "I'm a rancher, not a strategist. During the war, I followed orders. Now I'm making this up as I go." "You're doing better than most would." "I got shot." "You're alive. So are we. That's better." She hesitated, then added, "Thank you for not surrendering us." "Don't thank me yet. This is far from over." They stood in silence, watching darkness gather. Inside, Maylene lit a lantern, and warm light spilled through the shattered windows. The cabin looked wounded, but standing, like its occupants. That night, Caleb insisted on taking first watch despite his injury. The sisters didn't argue. They seemed to understand that he needed this, needed to prove to himself that he could still function, still protect. But as midnight approached, pain and exhaustion finally overwhelmed him. His head nodded forward, and he jerked awake to find Leanne standing before him. "My turn," she said softly. "You've done enough." "I can manage." "I'm sure you can, but you don't have to." She held out her hand for the rifle. "Let someone else carry the burden for a while." Something in Caleb resisted. He'd been carrying burdens alone for so long that accepting help felt like weakness. But his side throbbed with each breath, and his vision was starting to blur at the edges. He handed her the rifle. "Wake me if anything moves," he said. "I will." Caleb made his way to the bed, which the sisters had once again vacated in favor of blankets by the fire, and lowered himself carefully onto the mattress. Every movement sent fresh pain through his ribs. He closed his eyes, certain he'd be too wired to sleep. He was unconscious within minutes. In his dreams, he was back in the war. The smell of powder smoke and blood. The screams of wounded men. The weight of decisions that sent soldiers to their deaths. He'd been a sergeant, responsible for 18 men in his unit. By the war's end, only 4 had survived. The guilt of those deaths had driven him to Wyoming, to isolation, to a life where his choices affected only himself. But now he'd chosen again. Chosen to protect the sisters instead of surrendering them. Chosen to fight instead of negotiating, and that choice would have consequences. Always did. He woke before dawn to find Maylene gently changing the bandage on his side. Her touch was careful, professional. When she saw his eyes open, she offered a small smile. "It's not infected," she said quietly. "You were lucky." "Don't feel lucky. You're breathing. That's luck enough." She secured the fresh bandage. "Leanne told me what you said, about not knowing what to do next." "That bother you?" "No, it's honest." She sat back on her heels. "Do you want to know what I think?" "Go ahead." "I think you've been alone so long you've forgotten how to share problems. You're trying to solve this by yourself, protect us by yourself, make all the decisions by yourself." She met his eyes. "But you don't have to. We're here. We're capable. Let us help." Caleb studied her. This sister was different from Leanne, softer in demeanor, but no less strong. Where Leanne led with directness and challenge, Maylene offered something gentler but equally powerful. "What would you suggest?" he asked. "First, we fortify. Make the cabin defensible. Second, we prepare for a long siege. Conserve supplies, establish routines, stay alert. Third," she paused. "Third, we consider options you might not have thought of yet." "Like?" "Like making this arrangement legal." Caleb frowned. "What arrangement?" "You, us, this place." Maylene gestured around the cabin. "Right now we're fugitives you're harboring. That makes you vulnerable. But if we were family, the situation changes, legally, socially. Family. Or something like it." She held his gaze steadily. "I know how it sounds. We barely know each other. but desperate circumstances require unconventional solutions. Before Caleb could respond, Leanne appeared from outside, carrying an armful of firewood. She kicked snow off her boots and dumped the wood by the fireplace. "The big one left a blood trail heading east," she reported. "He won't make it far with that leg wound. The other probably abandoned him and ran. They're no longer a threat." "Others will come," Maylene reminded her. "I know." Leanne looked between her sister and Caleb, sensing the weight of interrupted conversation. "What did I miss?" "Maylene was suggesting," Caleb said carefully, "that we consider making our situation more official." Leanne's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Understanding, maybe. Or calculation. "She's right," Leanne said simply. "Chenway's men can claim we're escaped property. But if we're legally attached to you, as wives, as employees, as documented residents, that claim becomes complicated, messy, expensive to pursue." "You're talking about marriage." "I'm talking about survival." Leanne crossed her arms. "Marriage is a legal contract, that's all. It provides protection, status, documentation. In exchange, we'd work the ranch, maintain the household, contribute to shared survival." "You make it sound like a business arrangement." "Isn't it?" Leanne challenged. "You need help with a ranch. We need legal protection. Neither of us is proposing romance or affection, just practical alliance." Caleb looked between the two sisters. They stood side by side, mirror images presenting a united front. This wasn't impulsive desperation. They'd discussed this, planned it, come to agreement before broaching the subject. "Wyoming allows polygamy?" he asked. "No," Leanne admitted, "but it allows a man to marry and employ household members. If you married one of us, the other could be documented as family, sister to your wife, part of the household." "Which one?" The question hung in the air. For the first time, the sisters' unity wavered. They looked at each other, some unspoken communication passing between them. "Me?" Leanne said finally. "I'm the elder. I speak better English. I understand legal matters. It makes sense." Maylene nodded, though something in her expression suggested resignation rather than agreement. Caleb stood carefully, testing his injured side. The pain was manageable. Everything was manageable if you'd survived worse. "Let me think about it," he said. "How long?" Leanne asked. "Until I'm sure." He met her eyes. "This isn't a decision I'll make lightly. If we do this, I want it done right. Legal and binding and protected. Not some desperate scramble that falls apart the first time it's challenged." "Fair enough," Leanne inclined her head. "But don't think too long. The next riders could arrive any day." She was right, and they all knew it. The day passed in careful work. They fortified the cabin with additional boards across the windows, reinforced the damaged wall, cleared snow from around the structure to eliminate hiding places for potential attackers. Caleb's wound throbbed with each movement, but he pushed through. Pain was temporary. Vulnerability was fatal. By evening, the cabin looked more like a fortress than a home. Not beautiful, but defensible. As they sat down to dinner, salt pork and beans again, made palatable by Maylene's seasoning, Caleb made his decision. "I'll do it," he said abruptly. "The marriage, the legal protection, all of it." The sisters went still. Even Bear looked up from his spot by the fire. "You're certain?" Leanne asked. "No, but I'm willing." Caleb set down his fork. "Here's what I know. You saved my life today. Both of you, in different ways. You've worked hard, asked for nothing, and proven yourselves capable, and I'm tired of being alone." The last admission surprised him. He hadn't known it was true until he spoke it aloud. "So yes," he continued, "I'll marry Leanne. Maylene stays as family. We build something here together, not based on affection or romance, but on mutual survival and respect." "That enough?" Leanne extended her hand across the table. "That's enough." They shook on it, her grip firm and dry, a contract sealed with skin instead of paper. Maylene watched with unreadable eyes, but she nodded once. Agreement, acceptance. "When?" Leanne asked. "As soon as the snow melts enough to reach town. We'll need a magistrate, documentation, witnesses." Caleb paused. "And I'll need to buy rings. Can't do it proper without rings." "Rings," Leanne's voice softened. You're surprisingly traditional for a man proposing a business marriage. Tradition has weight, gives things meaning. He looked at both sisters. If we're doing this, we do it right. Not perfect, maybe, but right. That night, the three of them sat by the fire and talked, really talked, for the first time. Caleb told them about the war, about the men he'd lost, about why he'd chosen isolation. The sisters shared pieces of their own history, their childhood in Guangdong province, the illness that took their father, the debts that consumed their family, the journey across the ocean that ended in chains instead of opportunity. They spoke until the fire burned low and exhaustion claimed them all. When Caleb finally lay down to sleep, something had shifted. The cabin felt different, less empty, less haunted by absence. Three people, bound by necessity. It wasn't love, but maybe, Caleb thought as sleep took him, it was something strong enough to build on. The thaw came slowly, reluctantly, as if winter itself resented surrendering its grip on the high plains. For 10 days, the three of them existed in careful balance inside the fortified cabin. Caleb's wound healed clean, the angry red gradually fading to pink scar tissue. The sisters established routines that transformed chaos into order. Maylin took charge of meals and mending. Leon handled the heavier work of splitting wood and hauling water. They moved around each other with practiced efficiency, speaking little but communicating constantly through gesture and glance. Caleb found himself watching them more than he intended. The way Leon attacked each task with fierce determination, as if proving her worth through sheer effort. The way Maylene hummed softly while she worked, fragments of melodies from a homeland she'd never see again. They were so similar in appearance that strangers would struggle to tell them apart, yet their differences revealed themselves in 100 small ways. On the 11th morning, Caleb woke to the sound of water dripping from the eaves. The temperature had climbed above freezing during the night. When he stepped outside, the snow had begun its transformation from pristine white to gray slush. Icicles hung from the porch roof like crystal daggers, each one weeping its slow surrender to spring. How long before we can travel? Leon stood in the doorway, wrapped in one of Caleb's old shirts over her dress. They'd fashioned rough clothing from his spare garments, altered to fit their smaller frames. Nothing fit properly, but it was warmer than the thin gray dresses they'd arrived in. 3 days, maybe 4? The main trail will be passable, but it'll be rough going. Caleb scanned the horizon, searching for riders that never came. We'll need supplies, and I need to check on the cattle, see how many survived the winter. And then we go to town. Then we go to town. He turned to face her. You understand what that means? Once we file the paperwork, there's no taking it back. You'll be legally bound to me. I'm aware of how marriage works. This isn't marriage. Not really. It's a legal shield. Something flickered across Leon's face, hurt, maybe, or disappointment. But it vanished so quickly, Caleb couldn't be certain he'd seen it at all. Of course, she said evenly. A practical arrangement, nothing more. She went back inside before he could respond, leaving him standing in the melting snow with the uncomfortable sense that he'd said something wrong without knowing what. That afternoon, Caleb saddled Patience and rode out to survey the ranch. The snow had settled enough that he could navigate the familiar paths, though the mare struggled through drifts that still reached her chest in places. Bear bounded ahead, delighting in the freedom after days confined to the cabin. He found the cattle scattered, but mostly intact. 26 head, down from 30. Not terrible losses for a winter that severe. They'd weathered the storm by instinct, clustering in the sheltered ravines where wind couldn't reach them. Now they grazed on exposed patches of grass, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Caleb dismounted and walked among them, checking for injuries and disease. These animals represented his entire livelihood, such as it was. Losing more than 4 would have crippled him financially. He ran his hand along a cow's flank, feeling the sharp outline of ribs beneath winter rough hide. They'd all lost weight, but they'd survive until spring grass came in thick. As he worked, his mind drifted to the sisters waiting back at the cabin. In less than 2 weeks, they'd become woven into the fabric of his daily existence. He caught himself listening for Maylene's humming, anticipating Leon's blunt observations about his housekeeping failures. The cabin no longer felt like a refuge from humanity. It felt like a home shared with people who mattered. That realization unsettled him more than the gunfight had. He returned as dusk painted the sky in shades of copper and violet. Smoke rose from the cabin's chimney, and lamplight glowed in the windows. Approaching, he could see Leon outside splitting wood with methodical precision, each swing of the axe controlled and effective. She'd learned fast. 2 weeks ago, she'd barely been able to lift the tool. "Cattle?" she asked when he dismounted. 26 survived. Good enough. And your decision about timing? We leave day after tomorrow. Give the trail one more day to clear. Leon nodded and returned to her work. Caleb led Patience to the small barn, removed her tack, and rubbed her down. The familiar routine calmed something restless inside him. Horses didn't ask complicated questions. They didn't require emotional navigation. They just needed care, consistency, and respect. If only people were so simple. Inside, Maylene had prepared a stew from the last of their potatoes and salt pork. She'd somehow made it rich and savory, the broth thick with rendered fat and herbs. Caleb had eaten his own cooking for 6 years and never managed to create anything beyond barely palatable sustenance. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked, sopping up broth with hard bread. "My mother ran a small restaurant before my father's gambling debts consumed everything." Maylene's voice carried the flat tone of old grief, processed and filed away. "She taught my sister and me every technique she knew. She said a woman who could feed people well would never completely lose her value, no matter what else was taken from her. She was right. She was desperate. There's a difference." Maylene refilled his bowl without asking if he wanted more. "But yes, the skill has proven useful." After dinner, Caleb sat at the rough table and began writing a list. Supplies they'd need from town, legal documents to file, tasks to complete before winter returned in 8 months. The pencil felt awkward in his calloused hands. He'd done more physical labor than paperwork since leaving the army. Leon settled across from him, cleaning the Colt with careful attention. She'd kept it close since the shooting, checking it each evening as if expecting another attack. "You think Chen Wei's men will try again?" Caleb asked. "Eventually, but not soon. Word will have reached San Francisco by now that 3 men went after us and only 1 returned, wounded and empty-handed. Chen Wei will recalculate, send more men, better armed, with clearer instructions." She reassembled the pistol with practiced movements. "We have time. A few weeks, maybe a month. Then we use that time to build defenses, legal and physical." "Agreed." Maylene emerged from the back corner where they'd strung a blanket for privacy during washing and changing. She wore one of Caleb's old shirts as a nightdress, the fabric hanging to her knees. Her hair was loose and damp from washing, falling in dark waves around her shoulders. Caleb forced his attention back to his list. He'd seen both sisters in various states of undress while tending to his wound and managing the cramped cabin quarters. He'd trained himself to view it clinically, practically. But seeing Maylene like this, clean and soft in the lamplight, looking younger and more vulnerable than her daytime competence suggested, stirred something he'd deliberately buried for years. He scratched another item onto the list with more force than necessary. "You're afraid," Maylene observed, settling onto the floor near the fire to comb her hair. Caleb's pencil stopped moving. "Of what?" "Of this becoming more than a business arrangement." Leon looked up sharply from the pistol. The cabin went very quiet except for the fire's crackle and the whisper of Maylene's comb through wet hair. "That's not—" Caleb started. "You watch us," Maylene continued calmly, "not with suspicion or calculation, with something else. And it frightens you because you've built your entire life around not feeling anything for anyone." "Maylene," Leon said quietly, "a warning. He should know the truth. We're entering a legal contract. Honesty serves everyone better than polite fiction." Caleb set down the pencil. "What truth would that be?" "That you're lonely. That isolation hasn't healed you the way you hoped it would. That having us here has reminded you what it feels like to be part of something larger than survival." Maylene's eyes reflected firelight, dark and steady. "And that terrifies you more than Chen Wei's men ever could." The words landed like physical blows. Caleb wanted to deny them, to retreat behind the walls he'd spent years constructing. But sitting there in the cabin he'd shared with these women for 2 weeks, watching them transform his solitary existence into something resembling family, he couldn't summon the lie. "Yes," he said finally, "it terrifies me." "Why?" Because everyone I've ever... He stopped, reconsidered. During the war, I was responsible for men, good men. I made decisions that got them killed. 14 graves I can't visit because they're scattered across battlefields from Virginia to Georgia. After that, I swore I'd never be responsible for anyone else's life again. But you're responsible for ours now, Leon said softly. I know. And that's different from the war. We're choosing this, choosing you. You're not ordering us into battle. We're entering partnership. Doesn't change the weight of it. Maylene set down her comb. My mother used to say that refusing to care about people because you might lose them is just dying slowly instead of all at once. The pain is the same. Only one path offers the possibility of joy before the end. Your mother sounds like she was wise. She was, and she still lost everything. Maylene's smile was sad and knowing, but she had years of happiness first, years of love and purpose and belonging. When the debts came due and destroyed our family, she didn't regret the love. She regretted that it ended. Caleb absorbed that, turning it over in his mind. He'd spent 6 years believing that isolation was safety, that emotional distance was strength. But these two women had walked into his life through a blizzard and forced him to question everything he'd built. I can't promise to be what you need, he said carefully. I'm not good at this. Connection. We're not asking for perfection, Leon replied. We're asking for honesty, safety, and partnership. The rest can develop or not, as circumstances allow. And if it doesn't develop, if this stays exactly what we're calling it, a practical arrangement, the sisters exchanged one of their wordless communications. Then Leon answered, then it's still more than we had before. Still better than what waited for us in San Francisco or frozen in the snow. She met his eyes. We're not asking you to love us, Caleb. We're asking you to stand with us. Something in Caleb's chest loosened, some tension he'd been carrying since the moment he'd found them. They weren't asking for what he couldn't give, just what he could. All right, he said. Then that's what we'll do. The conversation ended there, but something had shifted. An unspoken understanding that this arrangement, however it had started, contained the possibility of becoming more. Not a guarantee, just a door left open instead of barred shut. That night, Caleb lay on his pallet and listened to the sisters' quiet breathing from the bed. He thought about his list, about the trip to town, about the legal bonds they'd forge. And for the first time since the war ended, he thought about a future that extended beyond simple survival. The second day of melting brought mud. Thick, clinging mud that sucked at boots and turned every step into a battle. Caleb spent the morning repairing the barn roof where winter's weight had damaged the supports. Leon worked beside him, handing up tools and holding boards steady while he nailed them in place. You're good at this, he observed, setting a nail with 3 precise hammer strikes. At following instructions? At anticipating what's needed. You hand me things before I ask for them. I spent 4 years learning to anticipate men's desires before they voiced them. Her tone was neutral, but the words carried weight. The skill translates to carpentry. Caleb paused, hammer raised. I'm sorry that happened to you. Why? You didn't cause it. Still seems like something worth apologizing for. On behalf of, he gestured vaguely. Men, in general. Leon's laugh was short and sharp. Men in general don't apologize. They justify. They explain. They insist circumstances required their choices. She looked up at him, squinting against the sun. You're unusual. Because I apologized? Because you meant it. They worked in silence after that, but it felt companionable rather than awkward. By midday, the roof was secure and they were both covered in mud and splinters. Inside, Maylene had been conducting her own repairs, patching holes in their meager clothing collection, reinforcing weak seams, transforming Caleb's spare shirts into something approaching proper dresses for herself and her sister. She'd found fabric scraps in an old trunk and was piecing them together with impressive ingenuity. We'll need better clothes for town, she said, examining a particularly worn patch on Leon's makeshift dress. We can't appear before a magistrate looking like refugees. We are refugees, Leon pointed out. Yes, but we don't need to advertise it. Maylene set down her sewing. Appearance matters. If we look desperate, people will treat us as desperate. If we look established, like we belong here, questions become harder to ask. Caleb hadn't considered that angle. What do you suggest? You have money for supplies? Some, not much. Enough for fabric, needles, thread? When Caleb nodded, Maylene continued. Then I can make us proper dresses. Simple, practical, but respectable. It will take most of tomorrow, but we'll look like frontier wives instead of runaways. Frontier wives, Caleb repeated. The word sounded strange. Foreign. That's what we'll be, Maylene said simply. Or close enough. Might as well look the part. That afternoon, Caleb conducted inventory of everything they'd need from town. The list grew longer than he'd anticipated. Flour, coffee, sugar, salt, ammunition, fabric, thread, boots for the sisters whose feet were still wrapped in improvised cloth shoes, paper for legal documents, and a dozen other necessities. The cost made him wince. His savings would take a significant hit, but the alternative was worse. If Chenway's men returned and found them unprepared, no amount of saved money would matter. As evening approached, Caleb stood on the porch and watched the sun sink toward the distant mountains. The snow was visibly retreating now, pulling back to reveal brown grass and muddy earth. Another day of melting and the trail would be passable. Ready or not, they'd make the journey. Nervous? Leanne joined him, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. She offered him one. About tomorrow? About all of it. The trip, the marriage, the life we're choosing. Caleb sipped the coffee, strong and bitter, the way he preferred it. Nervous suggests I have alternatives I'm weighing. This feels more like inevitability. That's bleak. That's honest. Fair enough. Leanne leaned against the porch post, her profile sharp against the fading light. Can I ask you something personal? You're about to become my wife. Seems like personal questions are allowed. Was there someone before? Before the war? Before Wyoming? The question surprised him. Caleb took a long drink of coffee, considering his answer. There was a girl. In Pennsylvania, where I grew up, Sarah. We talked about marriage before I enlisted. I wrote to her during the war, described what I was seeing, what I was doing. He paused, remembering. She stopped writing back after I told her about a particular battle. Too much honesty, I guess. She married a shopkeeper 6 months before the war ended. You loved her? I thought I did. Looking back, I loved the idea of her. The promise of normalcy, of a life that made sense. When she stopped writing, I was relieved more than heartbroken. He glanced at Leanne. Does that make me cold? It makes you realistic. Love is a luxury. Most people settle for partnership and convince themselves it's enough. Is that what you're doing? Settling? Leanne was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. I don't know yet. Ask me again in a year. They stood together as darkness gathered, drinking coffee and watching stars emerge one by one in the vast Wyoming sky. Inside, Maylene's humming drifted through the open door, a melody both foreign and familiar, marking the space they now shared as something beyond mere shelter. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Caleb woke before sunrise and found Maylene already working by lamplight, her needle flashing as she put finishing touches on 2 dresses. She'd transformed fabric scraps and his spare shirts into garments that were simple but dignified. Dark blue for Lion, deep green for herself, both with practical high collars and long sleeves suitable for frontier living. These are remarkable, Caleb said, examining the stitching. They're adequate. But Maylene smiled at the compliment. We'll look respectable, at least. That's all that matters. Leanne emerged from behind the privacy blanket, already dressed in the blue garment. The transformation was startling. She'd been striking before, but dressed properly with her hair pinned back, she looked like she belonged on this ranch. Like she'd been here for years instead of weeks. It fits, she said, smoothing the fabric over her hips. Perfectly. Of course it does. I made it for you. The casual confidence in Maylene's voice made Caleb smile. These women had been broken and sold, had survived things he couldn't imagine, yet they'd maintained skills and dignity and strength that circumstances couldn't erase. By mid-morning, they were ready. Caleb hitched up the wagon, a rough cart that served for hauling supplies and occasionally livestock. Patience pulled it with patient resignation. and Bear leaped into the back, tail wagging at the prospect of adventure. The sisters settled onto the bench seat beside Caleb, Lian in the middle, Maylene on the end. The arrangement felt natural, as if they'd been riding like this for years. Caleb flicked the reins, and Patience leaned into the traces. The ranch disappeared behind them as they followed the muddy trail toward civilization. The journey to Clearwater, the nearest town with a magistrate and general store, took most of the day. The trail was rough, rutted with melting snow and treacherous with mud. Twice they had to stop and dig the wagon free from particularly deep muck. But they made steady progress, and by late afternoon buildings began appearing on the horizon. Clearwater was a frontier town in the truest sense, maybe 30 structures clustered around a main street, most built from raw timber still showing saw marks. A general store, a saloon, a church, a hotel, a blacksmith, and a scattering of houses. Population couldn't have exceeded 200 souls, most of them miners and ranchers, and the people who served their needs. As the wagon rolled down the main street, Caleb felt eyes turning toward them. 3 people on a wagon wasn't unusual, but 2 Chinese women in frontier dresses, riding openly beside a rancher everyone knew preferred solitude. That was news. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Curtains twitched in windows. "Let them stare," Lian murmured. "Curiosity is better than hostility." Caleb hoped she was right. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the general store. Inside, the proprietor, a weathered man named Hutchins, who'd sold Caleb supplies for 6 years, looked up from his ledger and froze. "Thornridge," he said slowly. "Wasn't expecting to see you until spring properly arrived." "Need came early." Caleb handed him the supply list. "Can you fill this?" Hutchins scanned the paper, his eyebrows rising. "This is supplies for 3 people, maybe 4. 3. Planning on company?" "Already have company." Caleb gestured to the sisters who'd entered behind him. "Lian and Maylene. They'll be staying at the ranch." Hutchins' expression cycled through surprise, calculation, and careful neutrality. "I see. Well, welcome to Clearwater, ladies." "Thank you," Lian said with perfect courtesy. "We appreciate your hospitality." Her flawless English seemed to surprise Hutchins more than her presence. He recovered quickly, professional instincts overriding curiosity. "I can have these supplies ready in an hour. That give you time for other business?" "Should do." Caleb paid for half the order up front. "We'll be at the magistrate's office." "The magistrate." Hutchins' eyes sharpened with understanding. "Well then, congratulations are in order, I suppose." Word would be all over town within minutes. Caleb accepted that as inevitable. The magistrate's office occupied a corner of the church building. A sign outside indicated office hours twice weekly. Fortunately, today was one of those days. Caleb knocked, and a voice called for them to enter. Magistrate Cornelius Webb was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He'd served in some legal capacity back east before coming to Wyoming for his health. Now, he performed marriages, settled property disputes, and notarized documents for a town too small to attract a proper lawyer. "Mr. Thornridge," Webb said, rising from his desk, "this is unexpected. You're not one for town visits." "No, sir, but circumstances have changed." Caleb gestured to the sisters. "I'd like to formalize a marriage contract. This is Lian Chen. She's agreed to be my wife." Webb's expression remained carefully neutral, but his eyes took in every detail. The sisters' identical faces, their proper but simple dresses, the way they stood close together as if drawing strength from proximity. "I see. And the other lady?" "Maylene Chen, Lian's sister. She'll be part of the household as family." "Mm-hmm." Webb pulled out a heavy ledger and opened it to a blank page. "I'll need some information. Full names, ages, place of birth, current residence." Lian answered each question with precise clarity. "Born in Guangdong Province, China. 26 years old. Currently residing at the Thornridge Ranch on Bitter Creek. No prior marriages, no legal impediments to this union." Webb wrote it all down in careful script. When he finished, he looked up over his spectacles. "Miss Chen, I'm required by territorial law to ask you this directly, with your intended husband out of the room. Are you entering this marriage of your own free will without coercion or duress?" That's not necessary, Caleb started. It's the law, Mr. Thornridge. Step outside, please. Caleb exchanged glances with Leon, then complied. He stood in the church hallway with Maylin, listening to muffled voices through the door. He's being thorough, Maylin observed. He should be. After 5 minutes, Webb opened the door and beckoned them back inside. His expression had softened slightly. Miss Chen has confirmed this is her choice. I'm satisfied the union is legitimate. He consulted his ledger. The marriage can be performed immediately if you have witnesses. 2 adults, not related to either party. That posed a problem. Caleb didn't have friends in Clearwater, just business acquaintances. And asking strangers off the street felt wrong. But Maylene spoke up. Mr. Hutchins at the general store seemed friendly, and perhaps the Reverend, if the church is available? Webb considered that. Reverend Matthews is visiting the Miller Ranch today, but Hutchins would serve as one witness, and my wife could stand as the second. She's next door at the parsonage. 20 minutes later, they stood in the simple church with Hutchins looking bemused, and Mrs. Webb, a stout woman with kind eyes, standing witness. Magistrate Webb opened a worn book and began reading the standard territorial marriage ceremony. The words washed over Caleb in a blur. Legal phrases about partnership and obligation, about rights and responsibilities recognized under territorial law. None of it sounded romantic or meaningful, just bureaucratic confirmation of a contract being formalized. Then Webb reached the vows, and suddenly the words carried weight. Do you, Caleb Thornridge, take this woman as your lawfully wedded wife, to honor and protect, in hardship and prosperity, for as long as you both shall live? Caleb looked at Leanne standing beside him in her blue dress, her face composed but her eyes revealing depths he was only beginning to understand. I do. And do you, Leon Chen, take this man as your lawfully wedded husband, to honor and support, in hardship and prosperity, for as long as you both shall live? Leon's voice was steady. I do. By the authority vested in me by Wyoming territory, I pronounce you husband and wife. What has been joined here today, let no man separate. Webb closed the book. You may kiss your bride, if you wish. Caleb hesitated. They hadn't discussed this part. But Leon solved the problem by extending her hand instead. He took it, and they shook formally, while Hutchins and Mrs. Webb applauded politely. It was the least romantic wedding ceremony imaginable, and yet, as Webb filled out the marriage certificate in his careful script and handed it to Caleb, something profound had occurred. These women were no longer strangers he'd rescued from a storm. They were legally his family, his responsibility, his partners in whatever came next. Outside, the sun was setting, painting Clearwater's muddy street in shades of gold. Caleb helped both sisters into the wagon, then climbed up himself. The supplies from Hutchins' store filled the back, enough to last them through the rest of winter and into spring. As they drove out of town, Maylene broke the silence. Well, sister, you're a married woman now. Yes. Leon's voice was thoughtful. Strange how little has changed and how much is different. Caleb understood exactly what she meant. They were the same 3 people who'd entered town that morning, but the certificate folded in his coat pocket transformed everything. They had legal standing now, protection, recognition. And somewhere in San Francisco, when Chen Wei learned that his escaped property had married a rancher and gained territorial citizenship, his calculations would have to change. The war wasn't over, but they'd won an important battle. The ranch appeared as full darkness fell, the cabin's windows dark and welcoming. Caleb unhitched Patience and saw to her care while the sisters carried supplies inside. By the time he entered, Maylene had lit lamps and started a fire, and Liane was organizing the new provisions. They moved around each other with practiced ease, 3 people who'd learned each other's rhythms. When Maylene prepared the simple dinner of fresh bread from town and tinned peaches, a luxury after weeks of basic rations, they ate together at the rough table. To new beginnings, Maylene said, raising her cup of water. Caleb and Leon raised theirs as well, and they drank together. Later, as Caleb prepared his pallet by the fire, Leon stopped him. That's not necessary anymore, she said quietly. What isn't? You sleeping on the floor. We're married now. Even if it's just legal, appearances matter. She gestured to the bed. There's room for 3, if we're practical about it. Caleb froze. He hadn't thought this far ahead, hadn't considered the physical logistics of their arrangement. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, he said carefully. You won't. We're adults. We can share space without complications. But her voice held a tremor of uncertainty that revealed this was as unfamiliar to her as it was to him. Maylene emerged from behind the privacy blanket, already in her nightshirt. Leanne's right. This is practical, nothing more. The three of them settled into the bed with careful formality. Leon in the middle, Maylene on one side, Caleb on the other. The mattress was narrow, forcing them closer than comfort allowed. Caleb could feel Leanne's warmth along his side, smell the lavender soap Maylene had used for washing. For a long time, no one spoke. The cabin settled around them, familiar creaks and sighs. The fire burned low in the hearth. Bear snored from his spot on the floor. Then Leanne's hand found Caleb's in the darkness. She squeezed once, gratitude or reassurance or simply acknowledgement of the strange new reality they'd created. He squeezed back. And somehow, impossibly, Caleb Thornridge, who hadn't shared a bed with anyone in 8 years, who'd built his entire life around solitude, fell asleep surrounded by the quiet breathing of the family he'd accidentally acquired. The first week of their married life passed in a rhythm that felt both foreign and inevitable. Caleb woke each morning to find himself flanked by the sisters, their breathing soft and synchronized in the pre-dawn darkness. The intimacy of it should have felt invasive. 3 bodies sharing space meant for 2, limbs occasionally tangling during sleep, the scent of lavender and wood smoke woven together. But instead, it felt like the cabin had finally exhaled after years of holding its breath. Spring arrived in earnest. Snow retreated to the highest peaks, leaving the valley floor muddy and brown. Green shoots pushed through dead grass, and the creek swelled with runoff. Caleb's cattle spread across the range, grazing on new growth, their ribs gradually disappearing beneath healthier flesh. Leanne threw herself into ranch work with fierce determination. She learned to mend fences, check water sources, recognize signs of disease in livestock. Her hands blistered and bled, but she never complained. Each evening, Maylene would tend those wounds with quiet efficiency, while Leon sat stone-faced, refusing to acknowledge pain. "You don't have to prove anything," Caleb told her one afternoon, as they repaired a section of fence that winter had damaged. "I already know you're capable." "I'm not proving it to you." Leanne hammered in a nail with 3 precise strikes. "I'm proving it to myself. You've already survived more than most people face in a lifetime. Survival isn't achievement, it's just continuation." She reached for another nail. "I want to build something, create value beyond simply existing." Caleb understood that impulse. The war had taught him that survival alone wasn't enough. People needed purpose, needed to contribute something meaningful to justify the space they occupied in the world. While Leanne learned the outdoor work, Maylin transformed the cabin itself. She scrubbed years of bachelor grime from every surface, organized supplies with systematic efficiency, and planted a kitchen garden in the patch of earth behind the cabin. Seeds they'd purchased in Clearwater went into careful rows: potatoes, carrots, beans, herbs. She worked the soil with her bare hands, humming those foreign melodies, coaxing life from dirt. "My mother always said a garden was proof that tomorrow mattered," she explained when Caleb asked about her dedication. "You don't plant seeds unless you believe in harvest." The 3 of them fell into patterns. Caleb and Leanne handled the heavy outdoor labor. Maylene managed the household, but also joined them for tasks that required multiple hands: moving cattle, clearing brush, hauling supplies. They ate meals together, worked together, shared the bed at night with decreasing awkwardness. Conversation came easier now. Caleb found himself telling stories about the war he'd never shared with anyone. Not the glory or heroism that people wanted to hear, but the small human moments that had sustained him. The private who could juggle 3 rocks while marching. The sergeant who wrote terrible poetry and insisted on reading it aloud. The shared whiskey the night before a battle, passed among men who knew some wouldn't see morning. The sisters shared their own histories in fragments. Maylin spoke of their childhood in Guangdong, the restaurant where they'd learned to cook, the festivals that marked the seasons, their mother's laugh, and their father's weakness for gambling. Leanne described the journey across the Pacific in the ship's hold, the confusion and terror of arriving in San Francisco, the gradual realization that the employment opportunity they'd been promised was something far darker. Neither of them spoke much about their 4 years in Chen Wei's establishment. Some wounds went too deep for casual conversation, but occasionally a detail would slip through. Maylene mentioning a customer who'd broken her wrist for serving tea incorrectly. Leanne describing the locked rooms and guarded doors, the casual violence that had been their daily reality. Caleb listened and stored each detail away, building understanding of what they'd survived. It made their current strength even more remarkable. These women should have been broken. Instead, they'd somehow forged themselves into something harder than the circumstances that had tried to destroy them. 3 weeks after the wedding, Caleb rode into Clearwater alone to pick up supplies Hutchins had special ordered. When he entered the general store, he found the shopkeeper deep in conversation with a stranger, a well-dressed man with calculating eyes and expensive boots. The conversation stopped abruptly when Caleb entered. "Thornridge," Hutchins said, his voice carrying an odd tension. "Your order's ready. Let me get it from the back." He disappeared into the storeroom, leaving Caleb alone with the stranger. The man studied Caleb with undisguised interest. "You're Thornridge?" he asked. "The rancher who married the Chinese woman?" "I am." "Interesting timing. I've been asking around town about 2 Chinese women who might have passed through recently. Runaways from San Francisco. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Ice flooded Caleb's veins. He kept his expression neutral, his hand resting casually near the Colt at his hip. "I know my wife and her sister came from California," he said evenly. "Beyond that, their past isn't my concern." "But it is mine." The man smiled, showing too many teeth. "My employer has significant financial interest in recovering his property. 2 women who fled San Francisco 3 months ago. Twins. Very distinctive. Slavery's illegal." "Oh, this isn't slavery. This is breach of contract. The women owed debts. They fled without fulfilling their obligations. My employer simply wants what's legally his." "Your employer," Caleb said quietly, "can take his legal claim and test it against territorial law. My wife is a citizen now, married to an American. Whatever debt she supposedly owed died when she took her vows." The man's smile didn't waver. "That's an interesting legal theory. I wonder if a territorial judge would agree." "Well, I guess we'll find out if your employer decides to file suit." Caleb took a step closer, closing the distance between them. "But here's something to consider. This is Wyoming territory. We don't take kindly to outsiders coming in and making claims on our people, especially when those claims smell like something that should have died with the Confederacy." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm informing you. There's a difference." Hutchins emerged from the back with Caleb's supplies, his eyes darting nervously between the 2 men. "Here you go, Thornridge. That'll be $8. Caleb paid without taking his eyes off the stranger. "This gentleman was just leaving, weren't you?" The man's expression hardened. "My employer doesn't give up easily. He has resources, connections, legal standing. Then he should use them, file a proper suit, come at this the right way, not through hired thugs and bounty hunters." Caleb collected his supplies. "Though I should warn you, the last men who came for my wife didn't fare well. One's buried on my property. The other 2 limped away bleeding. That's a pattern I'm comfortable continuing." The threat hung in the air between them. Finally, the stranger tipped his hat with mocking courtesy. "I'll convey your message to Mr. Chen Wei. I'm sure he'll find it educational." He left the store, expensive boots clicking on the wooden floor. Through the window, Caleb watched him mount a fine horse and ride east toward the main road. "That's trouble," Hutchins said quietly. "That man works for Chen Wei's lawyer in Sacramento. He's been in town 2 days, asking questions, making inquiries." "What kind of inquiries?" "About the legality of your marriage. Whether territorial law protects women who fled contractual obligations in California. Whether a magistrate's ceremony is sufficient to grant citizenship." Hutchins shook his head. "He's building a legal case, Thornridge. This isn't going to go away." Caleb felt cold certainty settle in his gut. The gunfight had been just the opening move. Now Chen Wei was bringing lawyers, judges, the full weight of institutional power. Fighting bullets was straightforward. Fighting legal proceedings was something else entirely. "Thanks for the warning," Caleb said, "and for not telling him anything useful. I told him the truth, that you married Lian Chen in a proper ceremony with witnesses and documentation. Nothing more, nothing less." Hutchins leaned against the counter. "But Thornridge, you should know. Some folks in town are talking, saying you married her to avoid legal consequences. That it's a sham meant to protect criminals. Let them talk. Talk turns into testimony if this goes to court. Chen Wei's lawyer will find sympathetic voices if he looks hard enough. Caleb gathered his supplies and headed for the door. Then he paused. Those people talking, they know what happened to the last men who came for my wife? They've heard. Good. Let them keep that in mind when they decide whose side they're on. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than usual. Caleb's mind churned with scenarios, contingencies, possibilities. Chen Wei wasn't just wealthy. He was connected, patient, willing to play the long game. A man like that wouldn't be deterred by one failed attempt or even by legal obstacles. He'd probe for weaknesses, exploit every advantage, use the system itself as a weapon. When the cabin came into view, Caleb saw Lian working with the cattle in the near pasture while Meilin tended her garden. The scene looked peaceful, domestic, like something that had existed for years instead of weeks. But that peace was an illusion, fragile as spring ice. He pulled the wagon to a stop, and both sisters looked up. Something in his expression must have communicated trouble because Lian immediately started walking toward him. What happened? She asked. Caleb climbed down from the wagon. Chen Wei's lawyer was in town, asking questions, building a case. Lian's face went carefully blank. What kind of case? Claiming you breached contract by fleeing, arguing that the marriage doesn't protect you from prior legal obligations. He paused. He implied they might try to have you extradited back to California. Meilin had joined them now, dirt on her hands and worry in her eyes. Can they do that? I don't know. Territorial law is complicated. Marriage usually grants citizenship and protection, but if Chen Wei can prove you fled legitimate debts, if he can make it about contract law instead of slavery— Caleb shook his head. We need a real lawyer, someone who understands how to fight this properly. Lawyers cost money, Lian said. I have some savings. Not enough for a fight against Chen Wei. He'll bury us in legal fees before we ever see a courtroom. She was probably right. Chen Wei could afford to drag this out indefinitely, filing motion after motion, hiring the best legal minds in California. Caleb was just a rancher with modest savings and land that barely turned a profit. Then we find another way, Meilin said quietly. Both Caleb and Lian turned to look at her. Chen Wei's strength is money and connections. We can't match that, but we have something he doesn't. What's that? Caleb asked. We're here. We're real people with real lives in a real community. He's an abstract threat from California. If we can make ourselves matter to this town, make them see us as part of their community rather than foreign problems. She trailed off, letting them complete the thought. Lian nodded slowly. Public sentiment. Make it politically costly for a judge to rule against us. It's harder to tear apart a family that people know and respect, Meilin continued, especially in a place like Wyoming where community bonds matter. Caleb considered the strategy. It was smart, playing to their strengths instead of trying to match Chen Wei's resources. But it meant exposure, vulnerability, allowing the town to examine their lives and judge their legitimacy. How do we do it? He asked. We participate, Meilin said. Church services, town gatherings. We help neighbors. We become people instead of abstractions. I haven't been to church in 8 years. Then it's time to start again. Lian's tone was practical. I know you hate crowds and social obligations, but this is survival, Caleb. Different battlefield, same stakes. She was right. Caleb had spent years avoiding human connection, but that isolation had become a liability. To protect this family, he'd have to do the thing he'd been avoiding since the war ended. He'd have to rejoin humanity. That Sunday, they rode into Clearwater for church services. The sisters wore their best dresses. Meilin had modified them with small touches that made them look more established, less makeshift. Caleb wore his cleanest shirt and the coat he reserved for rare trips to town. They looked, he hoped, like a legitimate frontier family. The church was the same simple building where they'd married. Reverend Matthews stood at the door greeting arrivals, his weathered face creasing with surprise when he saw them approach. Mr. Thornridge, ladies, welcome. Reverend, Caleb shook his hand, thought it was time we participated in community worship. Matthew's eyes sparkled with understanding that went beyond the surface explanation. The Lord welcomes all to his house. Please, find a seat. Inside, the small church was perhaps half full. Conversations died as the three of them entered. Every eye tracked their progress down the center aisle. Caleb felt the weight of judgment, curiosity, and speculation pressing against them like physical force. They settled into a pew near the middle, not so far back as to seem diffident, not so far forward as to appear presumptuous. Maylene and Leanne sat on either side of Caleb, their posture perfect, their expressions composed. The service began. Reverend Matthews was a competent preacher, neither brilliant nor boring. He spoke about community, about caring for neighbors, about the biblical mandate to welcome strangers. Whether the sermon had been planned or was improvised for their benefit, Caleb couldn't say. But the message was clear. After the service, people approached cautiously. Mrs. Webb, who'd witnessed their wedding, led the way. "Mrs. Thornridge," she said warmly, addressing Leanne, "how lovely to see you in church. And you must be Maylene?" "Yes, ma'am." Maylene's curtsy was subtle but perfect. "Thank you for your kindness at the wedding." "It was my pleasure. You must come to the ladies' auxiliary meeting next week. We gather every Thursday to work on quilts and discuss community needs. New voices are always welcome." Other women gathered around, and soon the sisters were surrounded by a cluster of frontier wives asking questions, offering advice, extending tentative welcome. Caleb watched with something like awe as Leanne and Maylene navigated the social dynamics with practiced grace. They'd learned to read people in Chenway's establishment. That skill translated seamlessly to reading the women of Clearwater. The men approached Caleb more directly. Hutchins, the storekeeper. A rancher named Morrison, who owned land adjacent to Caleb's. The blacksmith, a barrel-chested man named Boone. "Heard you had trouble with bounty hunters," Morrison said bluntly. "That true?" "It's true." "And the Chinese women? Their why?" "My wife and her sister were fleeing an employment situation in San Francisco. Men came looking to return them. I declined to cooperate." Boone grunted. "Heard you killed one of them." "Self-defense. They broke into my cabin with weapons." "Territorial law allows a man to defend his property and family," Morrison observed. "No shame in that." The conversation felt like a test. These men were deciding whether Caleb's actions were justified or whether he'd brought trouble that might spill over onto their own families and ranches. "The man buried on your land," Boone continued. "You notify the sheriff?" "Nearest sheriff is 3 days' ride. By the time I could report it, the body would have been frozen solid or eaten by wolves. I made the practical choice." Boone nodded slowly. "Practical. I respect that." The tension eased fractionally. Not acceptance, exactly, but the beginning of understanding. Over the following weeks, the sisters attended every ladies' auxiliary meeting, helped with quilting projects, contributed to church socials. Maylene's cooking became legendary. She could transform basic frontier ingredients into dishes that made hardened ranchers wax poetic. Leanne's direct competence won respect from women who valued capability over charm. Caleb, meanwhile, began accepting invitations he'd previously declined. He helped Morrison mend fences, assisted Boone with a complicated shoeing job on a difficult horse, participated in the community barn raising when a family lost their structure to spring storms. Slowly, incrementally, they became part of Clearwater's fabric. But the threat from California didn't disappear. If anything, it intensified. 6 weeks after the wedding, a formal legal summons arrived via postal rider. Chenway was filing suit in territorial court claiming breach of contract and demanding the return of property valued at $2,000, the amount he claimed to have invested in purchasing and maintaining the sisters. Magistrate Webb brought the summons personally to the ranch, his expression grave. "This is serious, Thornridge. He's got lawyers in Sacramento and San Francisco working the case. They're arguing that California contract law supersedes Wyoming marriage protections." Caleb read through the legal document with growing anger. The language was clinical, reducing Leanne and Maylene to assets that had absconded with unpaid debts. "What are our options?" he asked. "Fight it in court. But you'll need representation, and good lawyers don't come cheap." Webb hesitated. "There's talk of bringing in a circuit judge from Cheyenne to hear the case. Chenway's people are pushing for expedited proceedings." "How long do we have?" 2 months, maybe 3 if we're lucky." After Webb left, Caleb sat at the table with the summons spread before him. The sisters read over his shoulder, their faces drawn. "I'm sorry." Lian said quietly. We brought this to your door. If we left, you're not leaving. Caleb's voice was flat, absolute. That's not even a consideration. But the cost, I don't care about the cost. He looked up at her, then at Maylene. You're my family now. That means something. It means I'll spend every dollar I have and mortgage this ranch if necessary to protect you. You barely know us, Maylene protested. I know enough. I know you're brave and capable and honest. I know you've survived things that would have destroyed lesser people. I know that having you here has made this place feel like a home instead of a prison. His hands tightened on the summons. So no, you're not leaving. We're fighting this together. Lian's eyes were bright with unshed tears. She nodded once, sharply, and turned away before emotion could overwhelm her control. That evening, as they prepared for bed, Maylene voiced what they'd all been thinking. What if we lose? The question hung in the darkness. Caleb lay between the sisters, feeling the warmth of their bodies, smelling lavender and wood smoke and the earthy scent of honest labor. Then we run, he said, finally. Pack what we can carry, abandon the ranch, and disappear into Montana or Canada. Start over with new names in a place Chenway's reach can't extend. You'd do that? Lian asked. Give up everything you've built here? I've started over before. After the war, I came here with nothing but a horse and a rifle. Built this place from scratch. I can do it again. But you shouldn't have to. Neither should you. Caleb stared at the ceiling, barely visible in the darkness. We all carry things we shouldn't have to. The question isn't fairness. It's what we're willing to sacrifice to protect what matters. Silence settled over them. Then Lian's hand found his, and Maylene's fingers interlaced with his other hand. Three people, linked in the darkness, facing an uncertain future with nothing but determination and each other. The next morning, Caleb rode to Clearwater and sent a telegram to a lawyer in Cheyenne whose name Magistrate Webb had provided. The response came 3 days later. The lawyer would take the case for a retainer of $200 and $15 per day during court proceedings. Expected trial length, 5 to 7 days. The math was brutal. Caleb had maybe $400 in savings. The lawyer alone would consume most of it. Court costs, travel expenses, and other fees would drain the rest. And if they lost, he'd be broke and the sisters would be dragged back to California. But there was no alternative. They'd made their stand. Now, they'd see it through. As spring deepened into early summer, two parallel realities coexisted. On the surface, life continued its peaceful rhythm. Cattle fattening on spring grass, Maylene's garden producing its first tender shoots, the three of them working together to improve the ranch. But underneath ran a current of tension, the knowledge that everything they'd built could be torn away by a judge's ruling. The town rallied in unexpected ways. Mrs. E. Webb organized a fundraiser at the church, a potluck dinner where donations were collected to help with legal fees. It raised $63, a small fortune by frontier standards. Morrison and Boone went door to door among the ranchers, gathering statements attesting to Caleb's character and the sisters' contributions to the community. You're one of us now, Morrison said simply when he delivered the signed affidavits. We take care of our own. The word struck deeper than Caleb expected. For 8 years he'd held himself apart, convinced that isolation was strength. But these people, rough frontier folk with their own struggles and prejudices, had decided to stand with him, not because they necessarily agreed with everything he'd done, but because community meant something more than comfort and convenience. The week before the trial was scheduled to begin, another writer arrived. But this wasn't a lawyer or process server. This was something worse. Chenway himself had come to Wyoming. Caleb was mending the barn door when a carriage rolled up the drive, an expensive coach completely out of place in the rough country, pulled by matched horses that probably cost more than Caleb's entire herd. The man who emerged wore a silk suit and carried a walking stick with a silver handle. Mr. Thornridge, I presume? His English was flawless, his bearing that of a man accustomed to deference. I am Chen Wei. I believe you have something belonging to me. Caleb set down his hammer slowly. I have a wife and her sister, both free women under territorial law. Ah, yes. The marriage. Chen Wei smiled without warmth. A clever stratagem, but ultimately futile. We'll let the court decide that. Must we? Courts are expensive, uncertain, messy. Chenwei gestured with his walking stick. I'm a businessman, Mr. Thornridge. I prefer negotiation to litigation. So let me make you an offer. Not interested. You haven't heard the terms. Don't need to. The answer's no. Chenwei's expression hardened. I'm offering you $500. Clean money? No questions asked. In exchange, you'll annul the marriage and return my property. They're not property. By California law, they are. Contractual obligations they haven't fulfilled. Debts they haven't paid. He paused. But I'm a generous man. I'm willing to forgive those debts entirely. Take my money, dissolve the marriage, and walk away. You'll be wealthier and free of complications. And the sisters? Will return to San Francisco to complete their obligations. Another 2 years of service and their debts will be cleared. Then they're free to pursue whatever lives they choose. 2 more years in your brothel. Caleb's voice was cold. Being used and abused by men with money and no conscience. That's what you're offering. I offer them honest employment in exchange for debts incurred. Nothing illegal about it. Everything about it is illegal. Just not prosecuted because you pay the right people to look away. Chenwei's facade of civility cracked. You're a fool. Do you think your crude frontier morality means anything against the weight of law and money I can bring to bear? I will crush you. I will bankrupt you. I will drag this through every court from here to Washington if necessary. And in the end, you will lose. Maybe. Caleb met his eyes without flinching. But you'll have to work for it. And every day that passes, those women are building lives here, making friends, becoming real people to this community instead of abstract property. You can win in court, but you'll have to enforce that ruling in a town that knows them, respects them, and won't take kindly to seeing them dragged away in chains. For a long moment, the two men faced each other, businessman and rancher, wealth against determination, power against principle. Then Chenwei smiled coldly. You'll regret this stubbornness. I've regretted plenty in my life. This won't make the list. Chenwei returned to his carriage. As it rolled away, Caleb saw the sisters standing in the cabin doorway. They'd witnessed the entire confrontation. He came himself, Leon said wonderingly. I never thought. He's desperate, Maylene observed. If he wasn't, he'd let his lawyers handle everything. He came because he's trying to intimidate you. Didn't work. Caleb returned to his hammer and the barn door. All he did was remind me why we're fighting. That night, the three of them sat on the porch and watched stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. The air was sweet with sage and new grass. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the moon. I've been thinking, Leon said quietly, about what happens if we lose. We run, Caleb reminded her. Start over. But we shouldn't have to. None of us should have to keep running. She turned to face him, her expression fierce in the starlight. So I've decided. Whatever the court rules, whatever Chenwei tries, I'm not going back. I'll die first. Leanne, I mean it. 4 years in that place nearly destroyed me. It would have if not for Maylene. I won't survive another 2 years. And I won't let them take my sister. Her hand found his. So if the ruling goes against us, I need you to promise me something. What? That you'll help us disappear. Not just run, truly disappear. New names, new lives, somewhere so remote that Chenwei's reach can't find us. Caleb looked at Maylene, who nodded agreement. These women were willing to abandon everything, any chance of normalcy, of community, of settled lives, rather than return to what they'd escaped. I promise, he said, whatever it takes. They sat in silence after that. 3 people bound by more than legal documents now. Bound by choice, by trust, by the shared determination to protect something fragile and precious that had taken root in the harsh Wyoming soil. The trial would come. Chenwei would bring his lawyers and his money and his righteous legal claims. The court would decide what law required. But regardless of that ruling, Caleb Thornridge had already made his decision. These women were his family. And family, he'd learned too late in life, was worth fighting for, worth dying for, if necessary. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal, as 3 people prepared for the battle that would determine whether they'd remain together or be torn apart by the machinery of law and greed. The circuit judge arrived in Clearwater 3 days before the trial, riding in on the morning stage with 2 leather cases and a reputation for fairness that made both sides nervous. Judge Harriet Blackwood was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She'd been one of the first female attorneys in Massachusetts before moving west and securing appointment as a territorial circuit judge. Wyoming Territory had granted women the right to vote and hold office before any state in the Union, and Blackwood embodied that progressive spirit with fierce intelligence. Her presence changed everything. Chen Wei's lawyers, 3 expensive suits from Sacramento, had been confident walking into Clearwater. A frontier magistrate, they'd assumed, would be easily swayed by proper legal precedent and formal California contracts. But Blackwood was a different proposition entirely. She'd built her career fighting for women's rights, and rumor suggested she had little patience for legal arguments that treated human beings as property. The trial convened in Clearwater's largest building, the Combination Church and Community Hall. Every bench was packed with townspeople, ranchers who'd ridden 2 days to attend, wives from the ladies' auxiliary who'd brought their knitting and settled in for the duration. Even children perched in the back, sensing that something important was unfolding. Caleb sat at the defendant's table with Leon and Maylin on either side. Their lawyer, a sharp young man named Daniel Hartley from Cheyenne, shuffled papers with nervous energy. Across the aisle, Chen Wei sat impassive between his 3 attorneys, his silk suit and silver walking stick marking him as foreign to this rough country. Judge Blackwood entered, and the room fell silent. She settled behind the makeshift bench, actually Reverend Matthew's pulpit, and surveyed the courtroom with the air of someone accustomed to commanding respect. "This court is now in session," she said, her voice carrying authority despite its moderate volume. "We're here to adjudicate the matter of Chen Wei versus Caleb Thornridge regarding the status of one Leanne Chen, now Leanne Thornridge, and her sister Maylene Chen. Mr. Harper, you represent the plaintiff?" The lead attorney for Chen Wei stood, a silver-haired man with the bearing of someone who'd argued before the California Supreme Court. "Yes, Your Honor. Edmund Harper of Harper and Associates, Sacramento." "And you, Mr. Hartley, represent the defendants?" "Yes, Your Honor." Hartley stood, looking young and uncertain next to Harper's polished confidence. "Then let's proceed. Mr. Harper, present your case." Harper's argument was methodical and devastating. He produced contracts signed in San Francisco 4 years prior, documents bearing signatures that looked like Leanne and Maylene's names rendered in Chinese characters. He presented financial records showing Chen Wei had paid substantial sums to acquire the sisters' labor contracts from their family's creditors. He outlined the terms of employment, 4 years of service to discharge debts totaling $1,800. "The defendants," Harper intoned, "fled their legal obligations with 2 years remaining on valid contracts. Mr. Chen Wei seeks only what California law entitles him to, the return of his contractual employees or compensation for their breach of service. The marriage performed in Wyoming Territory does not and cannot void prior legal obligations incurred in California." Hartley objected repeatedly. Contracts signed under duress, questions about the legitimacy of debt transfers, arguments about territorial sovereignty. But Harper had done his homework. Each objection was met with case law, precedent, and legal theory that painted Chen Wei as a legitimate businessman seeking redress for breach of contract. By the end of the first day, Caleb felt hope draining away. Harper was too good, too prepared, too confident, and the law, apparently, was on his side. That evening, back at the ranch, they sat around the table in grim silence. Hartley had returned to his hotel room to prepare for the next day's defense, leaving the 3 of them to contemplate disaster. "We're losing," Leon said flatly. "Those contracts are legitimate under California law. Nothing Hartley argued today changed that." "The trial's not over," Caleb protested. "No, but the outcome is clear. Harper will argue that California contract law supersedes Wyoming marriage protections. Blackwood might be sympathetic, but she's bound by legal precedent." Leanne's voice was steady, but her hands shook slightly. "We should prepare to run." Maylene had been quiet throughout dinner, pushing food around her plate. Now she looked up, her expression thoughtful. "What if the contracts aren't legitimate?" she said quietly. Both Caleb and Leanne turned to stare at her. "What do you mean?" Caleb asked. "Those signatures, the ones Harper showed in court." Maylene stood and began pacing. "They look like our names in Chinese characters, but I never learned to write Chinese. Neither did Lian. Our father taught us to speak it, but he believed his daughters needed English writing for opportunities in America. We can't write our own names in Chinese. Lian's eyes widened, which means those signatures are forgeries. Chen Wei or someone in his employ signed those contracts for us. Caleb felt a surge of hope, quickly tempered by reality. Can you prove it? I can demonstrate that I can't write Chinese characters, but proving those specific signatures are forgeries. Maylene shook her head. That's harder. It's a start. Caleb stood and grabbed his coat. I'm getting Hartley. This changes everything. By midnight, Hartley sat at their table with the contracts spread before him, listening intently as the sisters explained. His eyes grew brighter with each detail. If those signatures are fraudulent, the entire contract is void. No contract, no breach. No breach, no legal claim. He studied the documents under lamplight. But we need to prove it beyond doubt. Can you write something, anything, in Chinese to demonstrate your inability? We can't write Chinese at all, Lian said. Not a single character. Perfect. Hartley pulled out a blank sheet of paper. Tomorrow, I'll request that you demonstrate your signatures before the court, both English and Chinese. When you can only produce English, Harper's case collapses. Unless he argues we're lying, Maylene pointed out, pretending we can't write Chinese to avoid the contracts. That's where we get creative. Hartley's mind was clearly racing. We'll need someone who can verify that those signatures don't match standard writing patterns, an expert who can testify about Chinese calligraphy and forgery detection. Where will you find someone like that in Wyoming territory? Caleb asked. I won't, but there's a Chinese merchant in Cheyenne, runs a successful trading company. He's educated, respected, and crucially, he has no connection to Chen Wei. If I can get him here to examine those contracts, Hartley was already calculating. The stage runs tomorrow morning. I can have him here by the afternoon session if I send a telegram now. They worked through the night, building their strategy. By dawn, Hartley had sent 3 telegrams, one to the merchant in Cheyenne, another to a legal scholar at the territorial capital, and a third to a colleague who specialized in contract law. The responses came back within hours. The merchant, a man named Mr. Liu, would arrive on the afternoon stage. The legal scholar confirmed that fraudulent contracts were void regardless of California law. The colleague provided case precedents. When court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted. Chen Wei and his attorneys sensed something had changed in the defense's posture. Harper approached the bench with slightly less confidence than the day before. Judge Blackwood settled into her seat. Mr. Hartley, are you prepared to present your defense? Yes, Your Honor, but first, I'd like to request a demonstration. I ask that Mrs. Lion Thornridge and Miss Maylin Chen be allowed to provide handwriting samples before the court. Harper was on his feet immediately. Objection. Relevance? The relevance will become clear, Your Honor. I'm questioning the authenticity of the contracts Mr. Harper presented yesterday. Blackwood leaned forward, interest sparked. Authenticity? You're claiming those contracts are fraudulent? I'm claiming the signatures are, Your Honor, which voids the contracts entirely. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Chen Wei's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. Fear, perhaps, or calculation. I'll allow the demonstration, Blackwood ruled. Mrs. Thornridge, Miss Chen, please approach the bench. A table was set up with paper and ink. Hartley handed Lian a pen. Please write your name, he instructed, first in English, then in Chinese characters. Lian wrote her name in English, clear, precise letters that matched the English signature on the marriage certificate. Then she stared at the blank paper. I can't write it in Chinese, she said clearly. I was never taught Chinese writing, only English. Objection! Harper was on his feet. The witness is obviously lying to avoid. Mr. Harper, you'll have your chance to cross-examine. Blackwood's voice was sharp. Continue, Mr. Hartley. Maylene repeated the demonstration with identical results. 2 English signatures. Blank paper where Chinese characters should have been. Hartley produced the contracts and laid them beside the fresh signatures. Even from the gallery, the difference was obvious. The Chinese characters on the contracts were fluid, confident, written by someone educated in calligraphy. The English signatures were close but not identical to what the sisters had just written. Your Honor, Hartley said, These contracts bear signatures in Chinese characters allegedly written by two women who cannot write Chinese. I submit that these contracts are fraudulent. The courtroom erupted. Blackwood hammered for order, her face grave. Mr. Harper, she said when silence finally returned, how do you explain this discrepancy? Harper conferred quickly with his associates, then addressed the court. Your Honor, the inability to write Chinese characters today doesn't prove inability 4 years ago. The witnesses may have forgotten, or they may be deliberately misrepresenting their skills. Or, Hartley countered, they never had those skills in the first place because someone else signed these contracts on their behalf. I have an expert witness arriving this afternoon who can verify the forgery. This is highly irregular, Harper protested. So is human trafficking disguised as contract law, Blackwood said coldly. We'll recess until 2 o'clock to allow Mr. Hartley's witness to arrive. Court is adjourned. The afternoon session brought Mr. Liu, a dignified man in his 60s with scholar's hands and intelligent eyes. He examined the contracts with a magnifying glass, comparing them to the sisters' fresh attempts at writing. These signatures, he said in accented but precise English, were written by someone with formal education in classical Chinese calligraphy. The brush technique, the character formation, the balance, all indicate years of study. These women clearly lack such training. Furthermore, certain stylistic elements in these signatures match patterns I've seen in documents from Guangdong province, where Mr. Chen Wei originated. I would testify under oath that these signatures are almost certainly forgeries. Harper tried to discredit Liu's testimony, questioning his expertise and his potential bias. But Liu's credentials were impeccable, and his analysis was damning. The contracts bore signatures the alleged signatories couldn't possibly have written. By the end of Liu's testimony, the legal foundation of Chen Wei's case had cracked wide open. But Harper wasn't finished. He called Chen Wei himself to the stand. Under oath, Chen Wei presented a different narrative. Yes, he'd paid for the sisters' contracts. Yes, he'd employed them in his establishment, but he characterized it as legitimate employment, serving tea, entertaining guests with music and conversation, nothing improper. The sisters, he claimed, had been ungrateful for the opportunities provided, had stolen money from him, and had fled to avoid honest work. I gave them a chance at a better life, Chen Wei said smoothly, brought them from poverty to San Francisco, provided food, shelter, education and American customs. All I asked was 4 years of service to repay my investment. They betrayed that trust. It was a masterful performance. Chen Wei transformed himself from brothel owner to benevolent benefactor, wronged by ungrateful immigrants. Hartley's cross-examination was brutal. Mr. Chen Wei, you claim the sisters worked as tea servers and entertainers. What were they entertaining guests with? Music, conversation, cultural education. Cultural education. Hartley's tone was skeptical. Were they permitted to refuse guests? Refuse what? Any request a guest made. Chen Wei hesitated fractionally. They were employees. Employees fulfill their duties. That's not what I asked. Could they refuse if a guest requested something they didn't want to do? The question is absurd. We ran a respectable establishment. Respectable? Hartley pulled out a document. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence a police report from San Francisco. 3 years ago, officers responded to a disturbance at Mr. Chen Wei's establishment. A woman had attempted to escape through a second-story window. The report describes the establishment as a house of ill repute and notes that women were kept under lock and key. Harper objected furiously, but the damage was done. The document was authenticated, entered into evidence, and passed to Judge Blackwood. Hartley pressed his advantage. Mr. Chen Wei, were the sisters locked in? For their own protection. San Francisco can be dangerous. Protected by locks on the outside of their doors? Protected by guards who prevented them from leaving? They were free to leave when their contracts were fulfilled. But not before? Contract obligations, sus? Yes or no, Mr. Chen Wei? Were they free to leave before completing 4 years of service? Chen Wei's mask of civility slipped. No. But that's standard practice. Standard practice in slavery, perhaps, not in legitimate employment. The courtroom buzzed with shocked conversation. Blackwood hammered for order, but her expression had hardened. Whatever sympathy she might have had for Chen Wei's legal position had evaporated. The trial continued for another day and a half. More witnesses testified. Women from Clearwater's Ladies Auxiliary describing the sisters' contributions to the community, Morrison and Boone attesting to Caleb's character, even Reverend Matthews speaking to the legitimacy of the marriage and the family's participation in church life. Harper fought every point, but momentum had shifted irreversibly. The contracts were fraudulent. The employment was slavery by another name. The marriage was legitimate and performed in good faith. On the final day, Judge Blackwood called for closing arguments. Harper stood and made one last attempt to salvage his case. He argued that regardless of forgery, debts had been incurred. That Chenway had paid money and deserved compensation. That territorial law couldn't simply erase obligations created in California. Then Hartley stood for the defense. "Your Honor," he began, "this case was never about contract law. It was about power. The power of a wealthy man to exploit vulnerable women, to hide human trafficking behind legal language, to use courts as weapons to reclaim people he viewed as property." He gestured to Leanne and Maylene. These women were sold by their families' creditors, transported across an ocean under false pretenses, imprisoned in a brothel, and forced to serve men who viewed them as objects for pleasure. When they finally escaped, they survived a blizzard, gunfights, and now a legal battle designed to drag them back to hell. Hartley's voice strengthened. But they didn't just survive. They built lives, contributed to a community, married, and became citizens with all the rights and protections that entails. Mr. Chenway wants this court to erase all of that, to rule that California contracts signed under duress with forged signatures somehow supersede human dignity and territorial sovereignty. He paused, meeting Blackwood's eyes. "I'm asking you to rule that they don't, that Wyoming territory recognizes the humanity of all people within its borders, regardless of where they came from or what fraudulent papers claim to own them, that the law exists to protect the vulnerable, not to empower their oppressors." The courtroom was utterly silent. Harper began his rebuttal, but Blackwood raised a hand. "That won't be necessary, Mr. Harper. I've heard enough." She straightened the papers before her. "I'm prepared to rule." The tension was unbearable. Caleb reached under the table and found both sisters' hands. Their fingers interlaced, three people braced for judgment. "The contracts presented by Mr. Chenway are fraudulent," Blackwood said, her voice ringing with authority. "The signatures are forgeries, the terms unconscionable, and the entire arrangement constitutes involuntary servitude prohibited by federal law. Even if the contracts were legitimate, which they are not, they would be void as contrary to public policy." Chenway's face went white. "Furthermore," Blackwood continued, "the marriage between Caleb Thornridge and Leanne Chen was performed legally and in good faith. Mrs. Thornridge is therefore a citizen of Wyoming territory with all attendant rights and protections. No California court order can supersede that citizenship." She looked directly at Chenway. "Your suit is dismissed. You are ordered to pay court costs and to cease any further harassment of the Thornridge family. If you attempt to interfere with these people again, I will hold you in contempt and issue a warrant for your arrest on charges of attempted kidnapping." The gavel came down like thunder. The courtroom erupted in cheers. Lyon collapsed against Caleb's shoulder, her body shaking with relief. Maylin covered her face with her hands, tears streaming between her fingers. All around them, the people of Clearwater celebrated a victory that was as much about their community's values as it was about legal precedent. Chenway stood abruptly, his face a mask of fury. He said something sharp to Harper, then stormed from the courtroom without another word. His expensive carriage was gone within the hour, carrying him back toward California in failure. Outside the courthouse, townspeople surrounded the Thornridge family with congratulations and backslaps. Mrs. Webb embraced both sisters. Morrison shook Caleb's hand so hard it hurt. Even Magistrate Webb, whose initial involvement had seemed perfunctory, offered genuine warmth. "You did good, Thornridge," he said quietly. "Reminded us all what matters." That evening, they returned to the ranch as the sun painted the western sky in shades of copper and gold. The cabin looked the same as always, rough timber walls, smoke curling from the chimney, Bear waiting on the porch. But somehow, it felt different, more solid, more permanent. Inside, Maylene prepared a celebration dinner with ingredients they'd purchased in town, fresh vegetables, a chicken, butter, and cream. She hummed while she worked, those foreign melodies that had become the soundtrack of their home. Leon stood at the window, staring out at the land they'd fought to keep. Caleb joined her, and for a moment they just stood together in comfortable silence. "We won," she said finally, as if testing the reality of it. "We won." "I didn't think we would. Even with Hartley, even with the forgery evidence, I thought somehow Chen Wei would find a way." She turned to face him. "You mortgaged everything for us. The ranch, your savings, your entire future. Best investment I ever made. You barely knew us." "I knew enough." Caleb met her eyes, "and I've learned more every day since." Something shifted in the space between them. For months they'd maintained careful emotional distance, treating their arrangement as practical partnership rather than genuine marriage. But standing there in the golden light, having fought and won together, that distance felt suddenly artificial. "Caleb," Leon said softly, "this doesn't have to stay just a legal arrangement. If you wanted, if you were willing, it could become something more." His heart hammered against his ribs. "You sure that's what you want?" "I'm sure I don't want to waste any more of my life pretending I don't feel things, because feeling them seems risky." She took his hand. "You saved my life. You protected my sister. You stood against a powerful man when you could have walked away. If that's not worth taking a chance on, nothing is." Caleb pulled her close, and for the first time they embraced not out of comfort or necessity, but out of genuine affection. She fit against him perfectly, her head tucked under his chin, her arms tight around his waist. "I'm not good at this," he murmured into her hair. "Feelings, relationships, connection." "Neither am I. We'll figure it out together." Behind them, Maylin cleared her throat softly. They separated, suddenly self-conscious, but she was smiling. "About time," she said. "I was beginning to think you'd both stubbornly maintain the fiction until you were old and gray." "You're okay with this?" Caleb asked. "It changes the dynamic. It changes nothing that matters." Maylene returned to her cooking. "You're still my family. This cabin is still my home. Whether you and my sister pretend not to care about each other or finally admit the obvious makes no difference to me." Dinner that night felt like a true celebration. They ate until they were full, then kept eating because the food was good and the company better. They talked about plans for the ranch, improvements they could make, cattle they could buy, maybe even hiring help to expand operations. They talked about the garden, about the community connections they'd built, about the life they were creating together. As darkness fell and lamplight painted the cabin in warm gold, Caleb found himself thinking about the war, about the men he'd lost and the guilt he'd carried. For 8 years, he'd believed isolation was the only way to avoid causing more harm. But these women had taught him a different truth. Connection was risk. Love was vulnerability. Family meant responsibility that could end in loss and pain, but it also meant purpose, belonging. The knowledge that your existence mattered to people who mattered to you. Later, when they settled into bed, all three of them, as had become their habit, the configuration felt different. Caleb lay with Leon tucked against his side, her head on his shoulder, while Maylene curled on Leon's other side. 3 people, bound by law and choice and hard-won trust. "Thank you," Leon whispered in the darkness. "For what?" "For not giving up on us. For fighting when it would have been easier to surrender." "You did the same for me," Caleb said. "Gave me a reason to rejoin the world instead of hiding from it. We saved each other then." "Yeah, I guess we did." Sleep came easily that night, untroubled by nightmares or anxiety. Outside, Wyoming spread vast and wild under stars that had witnessed the birth and death of empires. Inside the cabin, 3 people slept peacefully, knowing that whatever challenges tomorrow brought, they'd face them together. The weeks that followed settled into a new rhythm. With the legal threat eliminated, they could focus on building rather than merely surviving. Caleb taught both sisters to ride properly, and soon they were helping move cattle and check fence lines. Maylene's garden flourished, providing fresh vegetables that transformed their diet. Leon proved to have a gift for handling livestock, patient and observant in ways that made difficult animals cooperate. One afternoon in late summer, Caleb sat on the porch with a piece of silver and a small hammer, carefully shaping 2 rings. The work was crude. He was a rancher, not a jeweler, but he poured attention into every tap of the hammer. Maylene emerged from the cabin and settled beside him, watching his work. "For Leanne?" she asked. "And for you?" She looked surprised. "For me?" "Your family, too. Seemed right that you should have something to market." He held up the smaller ring, examining it in the sunlight. "Nothing fancy, but permanent." Maylene's eyes filled with tears. "You don't have to." "I know, I want to." She was quiet for a moment. Then, softly, "I was jealous, you know, when you and Leanne started becoming something real. Not because I wanted you for myself, but because—" She trailed off, struggling for words. "Because you wondered where you fit in the new arrangement," Caleb finished. "Yes. You fit exactly where you've always fit, at the heart of this family." He handed her the smaller ring. "Try it on." The ring slipped onto her finger perfectly. She stared at it, tears tracking down her cheeks. "We don't need to define what this is," Caleb said quietly. "The three of us, I mean. Marriage, partnership, family. The labels don't matter as much as the reality. We choose each other. We protect each other. We build a life together. That's enough." Maylene wiped her eyes and smiled. More than enough. That evening, as the sun set in spectacular fashion, Caleb presented the larger ring to Leanne. It was rougher than a jeweler would make, the silver uneven and the band not quite circular. But Leanne's face lit up when she saw it. "You made this?" "Best I could manage. If you want something nicer, don't you dare." She slipped it onto her finger, holding her hand up to catch the dying light. "It's perfect." They stood together on the porch, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple. Three people who'd found each other through a blizzard and built something stronger than the storm that had brought them together. Autumn came with its riot of color. The aspen groves turned gold, and geese flew south in ragged V formations. Caleb and the sisters worked together to prepare for winter, cutting firewood, preserving vegetables from Maylene's garden, repairing the barn and cabin against the cold months ahead. One morning in October, a rider appeared on the eastern trail. For a moment, old fear flared. Had Chenwei sent someone else? But as the figure approached, they recognized Magistrate Webb. He dismounted and accepted the coffee Maylene offered, then pulled an envelope from his coat. "Thought you'd want to see this," he said, handing it to Caleb. "Came through official channels from California." Inside was a legal document. Chenwei's business license had been revoked by San Francisco authorities following an investigation into human trafficking. His properties had been seized, his assets frozen. He was facing criminal charges and extradition hearings. "Seems Judge Blackwood sent a very detailed report to federal prosecutors," Webb said with a slight smile. "They took an interest in Mr. Chenwei's business practices. He won't be bothering anyone for quite some time, if ever." The relief was profound. Not just the immediate threat removed, but the source of it destroyed. Chenwei couldn't send more men, couldn't file more suits, couldn't reach across the distance to harm them. He was finished. After Webb left, the three of them stood in the yard, passing the document between them. "It's really over," Maylene said wonderingly. "It's over," Leanne confirmed. They burned the document in the fireplace that evening, watching the paper curl and blacken. With it went the last shadow of their past, consumed by flames that transformed it to ash and smoke. Winter returned, but this year they faced it together and prepared. The cabin was tight and well-stocked. The cattle were healthy and fat. The three of them had learned to work as a unit, anticipating needs and supporting each other through challenges. On Christmas Eve, they sat together by the fire, drinking cider Maylene had made from apples purchased in town. Snow fell softly outside, coating the world in fresh white. But inside was warmth and light and the comfortable silence of people who belonged to each other. "I've been thinking," Leanne said, breaking the quiet, "about next spring. We should expand, buy more cattle, maybe hire a hand or two, build this place into something bigger." "Ambitious," Caleb observed. "We survived Chenwei. We survived a territorial court case. We survived a Wyoming winter. I think we can handle ambitious." Maylene laughed. "She has a point." They spent the evening making plans, sketching possibilities, dreaming of futures that extended beyond mere survival into genuine prosperity. Outside, the storm grew stronger, but they barely noticed. They had shelter, supplies, and each other. As midnight approached, Caleb looked at the two women who'd transformed his life. Leon, fierce and determined, her ring catching firelight as she gestured while talking. Maylene, gentle but strong, humming softly as she worked on mending. Both of them vital, irreplaceable parts of the life he'd accidentally built. He thought about the man he'd been a year ago, isolated, haunted, convinced that solitude was safety. That version of himself seemed like a stranger now. This Caleb had learned that connection was worth the risk, that family could be forged rather than born, that the walls he'd built to protect himself had actually been a prison. "What are you smiling about?" Leon asked, noticing his expression. "Just thinking about how different things are now. A year ago, I was alone. Now I have a wife and a sister and a future that looks like something worth building toward." "No regrets?" Maylene asked. "Not a single one." Leon stood and crossed to him, settling onto his lap with comfortable familiarity. Maylene joined them, and the three sat together in front of the fire, watching flames dance and feeling the deep peace of people who'd found their place in the world. Outside, wind howled and snow fell, and winter pressed against the cabin walls. But inside was warmth forged from something stronger than wood and stone. Inside was family, built by choice and defended by determination, sustained by the simple truth that sometimes the best things in life arrived unexpectedly during the worst storms. Caleb Thornridge had been a soldier, a survivor, a man carved from loneliness and loss. But through a blizzard's mercy and two women's courage, he'd become something more. He'd become a husband, a brother, a builder of futures. He'd become part of something larger than himself, connected to people whose lives mattered as much as his own. He'd become, finally, a man who belonged. As the fire burned low and sleep beckoned, the three of them made their way to bed. Tomorrow would bring work and challenges and the endless tasks of ranch life. But it would also bring possibility, partnership, and the steady accumulation of days lived together in purpose and peace. The wind sang its winter song across the high plains. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and in a rough cabin beside Bitter Creek, three hearts beat in rhythm, sheltered and strong, facing whatever tomorrow might bring with the unshakable certainty that they would face it together. The blizzard that had nearly killed them had instead delivered salvation. The storm that should have been an ending had been a beginning. And the family forged in that frozen crucible would endure, tested by hardship, strengthened by struggle, bound by something deeper than law or blood, bound by choice, by trust, by the fierce determination to protect what mattered most, bound by love, hard-won and honestly earned, in a harsh land that rewarded only those strong enough to claim it. They had claimed it, all of it, the land, the life, the love, and they would hold it together for all the days to come.